Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Became a Self-Made Poison? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Chapter 1. The Last Dose. Congratulations! Ruby red petals flooded the air as the happy couple walked in. Tashinori held up an arm to keep them from littering his bride's freshly done hair, though Inko didn't seem too worried. Even with all the congratulatory calls and yells of happiness, their eyes could only focus on each other, their fingers so tightly interlocked that even the parade of superheroes in front of them would stand little chance of pulling them apart. With weightless giggles they hurried through the waiting procession, giving each beloved guest a chance to shower them with their love and garden-made graffiti. The path lights installed on the botanical pathway gave them an almost ethereal glow, radiating the unbridled happiness in their flushed faces. One by one the students Tashinori had supported and trained, the children Inko had protected and cared for beneath her wings, hurried forward in pairs to offer their well wishes. In his place at the end of the line, Katsuki glanced across the aisle, smirking as Izuku's large green eyes watered in anticipation and overwhelming affection. When his mother had grown close enough, he abandoned his place in the procession, running forward to crush her in a tight embrace. Immediately the two burst into sobs, their heavy-hearted laughter the only clue that their shared emotions were joyous. Katsuki tossed a pair of old keys to his teacher, the key ring adorned with a small embroidered ribbon reading, "Just Married." Tashinori smiled thankfully, looking to be in no rush as his new bride smothered her son in kisses and words of admiration. "Izuku, my boy," he laughed, instinctively opening his arms in anticipation as Izuku finally peeled himself from his mother's embrace. Seeing his mentor, his hero, waiting for him with waiting arms seemed to only further break the composure he'd been holding onto all night, a red-cheeked sob escaping his throat as he hurried to hold the man in turn. Tashinori let out a boisterous laugh, smoothing down Izuku's wild curls as he cried into his shoulder. "Are you sure I can't convince you to come to Hawaii with us? You're 18 now. You've graduated. It's a momentous occasion," Tashinori called. Inko nodded, carefully fixing her face to avoid ruining the makeup Mitsuki had worked so hard on. "I know we insisted on having a send-off at the wedding with all the Udata graduates, but I want you to have something all for yourself. You've been so wonderful about the wedding preparation, but I haven't even asked what you want to do to celebrate." Inko rambled, joining herself in on Tashinori's hug, somehow managing to hold her son tighter than he was her, an impressive feat considering Izuku's recent strength gain. At her concern though, Izuku laughed, managing to pull himself back just far enough to plant a loving kiss on both of her cheeks. "Mom, I love you, but that is probably the worst idea I've ever heard, which is really saying something considering my friend group," Izuku chided. Inko let out a soft laugh that had already halfway gone into a sob as she buried her face in her son's shoulder, holding him close even as he pulled back to escort them to their waiting car. The getaway vehicle was a shining old pickup, decorated in ribbons and cans, likely a restoration project Tashinori had taken up in his newfound retirement. Tashinori opened up the passenger door for his new wife before moving to the driver's side. Without a twinge of effort, Izuku lifted her off the ground completely, the train of her dress curling behind her. Inko let out a surprised giggle as he placed her with great care onto the heightened truck cabin. When he was sure she was properly seated, he knelt to one knee, delicately gathering the fabric to tuck in the footrest beside her. Hopping on the high step, he gave her one last peck, her hands still careful to not entirely let him go. "The wedding was amazing, you two are amazing. Class 1A couldn't have asked for a better way to say goodbye. We'll have plenty of time to celebrate me when you get back. Now go. Stay safe and don't worry about everyone back home. Go. Enjoy your honeymoon." Izuku chuckled. Inko nodded, sloppy tears still pouring from her eyes. For the first time in a long time, though, there was no worry or agony, only an overabundance of happiness that spilled from her entirely too full heart. "I love you," she cried out, still grinning and looking as much as a fool as her own son. "I love you too. Take care of each other. We'll talk when you get back." Izuku assured, quickly giving the truck some room. Inko closed the door once she was sure her son had finished his goodbyes and for what felt like the millionth time that night letting her gaze fall to her new husband. Toshinori offered a reassuring smile, hand finding her own while the other twisted the key in the ignition. Well, I'm afraid I don't have much of a beach body anymore, Inko, but I hope you'll enjoy our time there together all the same. Toshinori laughed, flashing her an almost shy smile, a rarity for someone who was normally filled with such confidence. That's okay, Inko assured, squeezing his hand as the engine turned. Truthfully, skinny guys have always been more my type. Katsuki snorted from his place behind Izuku, who had very specifically turned to find something else to focus on other than his teacher and mother's banter. By the embarrassed red on his cheeks, though, it didn't seem to be working. With another round of waves, Toshinori began the slow roll out of the garden's path and to the main street. The wedding party crowded themselves on the property's edge, some rolling into the gravel pathway as they waved and cheered the newlyweds off to their next adventure. When they were long out of sight, the party finally began to disperse. Those with children sang their quiet goodbyes while others took one last celebratory drink at the bar. Though they were all almost officially adults, Class 1A was all too quick to begin cleaning up, their former class leaders taking one last familiar role to dictate their classmates to the chores laid out in front of them. After all, official or not, Inko and Toshinori had long ago been decided as family. Taking the time to make sure the reception was spotless was the least that they could do to try and repay them. Aya, Midoriya's mom, looked so appealing today. I can't believe she and All Might are finally married. Mina cooed, already far into a daydream as Katsuki finished packing away the last of the chairs. I can't believe Midoriya got his great butt from his mother. You'd think a woman her age would look a bit more loose, but Mrs. Yagi is keeping it tight. Denki slurred, practically dancing with his broom across the polished floor. The man was completely shit-faced, and while Katsuki wished he could say he was surprised, combining freshly legal graduates with an open bar was bound to produce a few drunken idiots. Denki being one of them was just par for the course. Denki, stop being so gross. You're totally ruining the mood. Mina scolded, the disgust clear in her face as he tripped over his own feet. What? A man can't appreciate a bro or bro's mom anymore. How's that fair? Katsuki's been checking out Izuku all night and no one's calling him gross, he stammered, his expectant eyes motioning themselves to Katsuki as if after that statement he would be in any mood to help. Katsuki growled low through his teeth, but whatever beating Denki was sure to receive was cut short as Ida tumbled into view. Denki, Mina, returned to sweeping at. We must have this place spotless before midnight so that Mr. and Mrs. Yagi see a return on their deposit. They have entrusted this to us specifically, we cannot let them down. Ida reminded, eliciting a long breath of frustration from the recent graduates. Yes, class rep, the two repeated, slinking dejectedly back to their duties. Katsuki forced his hands to unclench, the rising bout of anger calmed just as quickly as it had been spurned. Only a few years prior he would have chased it, reveled in how powerful it made him feel regardless of the devastation that it left in its wake. It didn't matter what or who his anger hurt, because it was never his fault he was angry in the first place. The problem wasn't the reaction or what immediately followed, but the fact that someone was stupid enough to make him feel it in the first place. Of course, things were never that easy, and what he had once considered a respectable part of his personality had cracked and revealed the ugly bits beneath. He wasn't honest, he lied every chance he got, even to himself. He was just a rude punk who liked how it felt to say things others had rightfully kept inside. He wasn't a forerunner, he was brash and impatient. Sure, it kept him alive some of the time, his risk paying off, his ego just close enough to the truth to allow him to scrape by, but it didn't mean it wasn't a hindrance. It was a parasite, an instinct he had to fight through every time something went the least bit off of plan. He had done a lot of growing since entering youth, and even when he was at his most frustrated, analyzing and picking apart the bits of him that made him weak, he could at least say that he was objectively a better person, a better hero than he'd been before. So why, when he thought of debuting on the hero boards, did he still feel so unbearably shitty? The chairs are all finished up, you'll just need to get one of the knuckleheads to run them up into the truck, Katsuki called, grabbing his tux jacket off of the last remaining table. Are you calling it a night already, Bakugo? Normally you'd be jumping at the chance to organize a cleaning venture dash, Ida began, but Katsuki forced a rather animated yawn from his lips, practically cracking his jaw before peering down to the waiting watch on his wrist. Yeah, no, it's too late for me to still be awake. I did my job, the rest of you have got this, he muttered, eyes skillfully taking inventory of the rest of the room. His mom and dad were pointedly missing from the remaining crowd. The old hag had gotten pretty drunk during the reception, more likely than not the two were making out in some poor janitor's closet, a feat not even the actual high school-aged attendants had managed to stoop to. Well, let me at least go and find Midoriya. I know that he'll want to thank you for all your help today. I believe he's also in charge of the MSTR list for everyone's new addresses and contact information. I've already reminded you, but you'll need to tell him what day you're flying out. Everyone who's still left in Mizudafu will want to give you a grand send-off. Ida shouted. Katsuki felt his teeth grind beneath the words, tightening his jaw in the way he often did when holding back a biting remark. This time, however, it was not anger masked beneath his face, but something much harder to decipher. Guilt? Don't bother, Nerd's probably fallen asleep crying on the toilet or something. We've got phones, he can text me whatever, Katsuki muttered. Ida looked at Katsuki for a long moment, as if trying to see just far enough past the surface to see the cause of a ripple above. Whatever he was searching for he didn't find, so instead he merely clasped Katsuki's large shoulders and gave him a hearty pat. All right. Thank you for your help today, Bakugo. Remember to relay your flight plans to Midoriya, preferably 5 to 6 hours ahead of your boarding time as is recommended for international airlines. Katsuki rolled his eyes in irritation but nodded, peeling Ida's hands from his shoulder. Managing a half-butted wave, he slipped himself out of the ballroom doors, grateful to not be stopped by any of the other stragglers along the way. He hadn't been lying when he said he was tired. It felt like he hadn't had time to catch his breath for the past 3 years, entering Yude, being hunted by the League of Villains, starting the Hero War, ending the Hero War, cramming years of lost studies into a span of months, toiling over what agency would be best for him, scrambling through finals and graduation, sleepwalking from one obligation to the next. But this was the last one, the last time all of 1A would be together, the last time they sat at a table as equals before their future carried them where it wished. So, with less arguing than he wanted, he had stayed for the entirety of the wedding, had watched as his friends made complete fools of themselves, had allowed them to drag him into their nonsense, and finally, after years of fighting, let himself breathe. And it made him realize he was incredibly, idiotically tired. He wasn't stupid enough to think that his parents would be out in the car waiting for him, but he was naive enough to at least hope. He rolled his eyes when he found the sedan empty, his hands idly patting across his pockets for a set of keys. He groaned in recollection, his father having taken them early on in the day to make an emergency sewing trip for the bride and groom. He'd warned them that something would happen, that it would be easier to pack their kit than it would be to find a needle and thread in the middle of the countryside, but of course they hadn't listened. Deciding it was better to wait in the cold than try and face his friends again, he resigned himself to leaning against the door, taking in the quiet dark around him. With a slow, practiced breath, he allowed his eyes to shut, only gathering a moment's peace before he felt the familiar mist of rain wetting his face. Sure enough, by the time that he'd managed the energy to open his eyes, the skies had begun their fall in earnest, a steady stream of water pouring from the obscured night sky and onto the garden. But CRP, CRP, CRP. The top's still open. This is what I get for trying to look cool dash, an unexpected voice whispered. Katsuki didn't have to look to know exactly who it belonged to, could make out his whisper 50 miles away. Izuku flopped himself over the door of his beat-up convertible, his short legs practically kicking in panic as he turned the engine over and started the process of bringing the car's soft top back into place. And yeah, maybe Katsuki enjoyed the view for a bit longer than he was willing to admit, but that was just because he was a guy. A guy attracted to other guys. That realization had of course caused a bit of emotional turmoil when it first appeared, but he had grown, he was different now. He hadn't exactly made it public, but it wasn't because he was ashamed, it just had never seemed relevant. He was never interested in having a relationship with anyone in the first place, so in the end it didn't matter what side of the fence people thought he was on. He would just enjoy what he enjoyed, silently and without need for anyone else to know. It was a boundary, one he would not be crossing anytime soon. And right now that boundary meant he was allowed to appreciate the custom breathes his mother had made and the way they clung to all the right places, especially when he was stuttering like an idiot, half hung over the convertible side door. And yet it was Deku. Dorky, blubbering Deku, but even a heterosexual idiot like Mineta could see how good he looked tonight. Most nights. Every night. What he wasn't allowed to do was feel beyond that, to imagine that he'd worn those clothes in hopes of catching his eyes, that he wanted to be wanted, so he pushed that rush of warmth aside, locked it in a vault that was already threatening to burst and repeated his practiced mantra in his head. Admiring Izuku was fine, healthy even, but if that nerd ever realized the way that admiration was twisting into feelings, Izuku would be petrified. Disgusted. That was too far, that crossed a line, that took consent away from someone who had no idea they were even being propositioned. So he just didn't do it. He didn't feel those things. Those feelings were wrong, even if he'd accepted that everything else was okay. So he simply watched, allowing himself a smirk as Izuku climbed off the door back to solid ground. Even from this far Katsuki could see the comical panic rippling throughout his body. He frantically looked around him, though Katsuki wasn't sure what he hoped to find, before eventually grabbing the sleeve of his suit jacket and attempting to wriggle his arm out. Katsuki thought maybe he was just trying to readjust, only to realize as he started with the other sleeve, he was just taking the jacket off in one of the most clumsy, alien-like ways possible. It was like watching someone bite into a Kit Kat hole. Monstrous. Katsuki groaned, like the one action itself had thrown him back to reality. Nice breathes or not, Izuku was still an idiot. This was only clarified by the ridiculous car Izuku stood next to. Normally, no matter their age, convertibles oozed cool. They were sleek and CC, packed with power, and so incredibly impractical that they pretty much cemented their place in history as the car a man had when he could have anything. Pretty much the exact opposite of Izuku. Somehow the idiot had managed to find the one vintage relic that made him look like even more of a dork. The car was dated, not dingy, but old enough that even proper care couldn't keep it from having lost its luster and shine. Izuku had lovingly referred to it as a pagoda because of the strange roof shape, though what the actual official title for it was Katsuki couldn't be bothered to remember. It was a nice shade of emerald green, though of course Izuku had effed that up by installing a bright red soft top. Katsuki refused to go near it unless he promised to keep that thing locked away and hidden. It would be bad enough to be seen being driven around by Deku, let alone looking like that. He had to have some dignity, he was going to be the #1 hero after all. Cars weren't really needed in this part of Japan, but somehow Toshinori had gotten it in his head that they should fix up an old project together before Izuku graduated, just in case he needed it. Izuku had never been one to accept gifts or being spoiled, he'd told Toshinori as such, but the man had been insistent. Maybe he'd secretly been hoping the gesture would serve as a sign that he and Inko were alright if he wanted to move on, handing over the keys to exploration instead of trying to coddle or hold him too close. Inko had always been a bit overbearing, and during the years of the war Toshinori too had grown paranoid and anxious over Izuku's well-being. When the danger had finally passed, that need to protect him from anything further had dug its claws in strong. They had come on too strong, trying to control Izuku's path so that he remained safe and cared for rather than letting him fall or fail on his own. It was only when he'd begun his senior year that they realized their folly, their child suddenly months from being an adult. Still, the time hadn't been a complete waste. It turned out, buried somewhere in Izuku's big stupid nerd brain was a bit of an engineer. Katsuki wouldn't go so far as to say he was a gearhead, but there was an unspoken pleasure about ripping something broken apart to create something usable and new that really clicked with Izuku's line of obsession. He could still remember the day that Izuku had found it, his car, his project. He had known the two were hopping from junkyard to junkyard that day, but by the way his phone had blown up with frantic messages and calls Katsuki had ran, to pick it up. It was embarrassing to think about now, but even in recollection he could feel how his heart had gone 20 miles a minute, thinking of all the ways Izuku could be hurt, kidnapped, beaten, or scared. He'd assumed the worst, though he couldn't exactly fault himself for it. After All for One and the League had only recently been defeated. Months had passed, but most of those had been spent in the hospital, recuperating from the absolute devastation their final battle had caused. Class 1A had somehow all survived, but that hadn't applied to all of their allies, to all of the heroes that had stepped up that day. Katsuki and Izuku were in the hospital the longest, having been the actual two to bring Shigaraki down. Katsuki had fallen first, leaving Izuku to face the demon alone. He hated himself for that, killed himself with rage as he lay useless in his bed, knowing that he could have saved so many more people if he'd just not been so damn weak. All for One should never have gotten that close. Shigaraki should have never left that DMN floating prison. The only reason Shigaraki had that chance to strike when he did was because Katsuki couldn't keep up, because even in his minor background character role he had not been strong enough to do as he was told. He was supposed to protect Deku, to keep the symbol of peace alive, and he'd almost failed in that completely. It was insane how quickly the rest of the world moved on, how easily they fell back into day-to-day routines as if the war had never happened. Only days after being dismissed from the hospital, his father was helping him put his uniform on, gently guiding his broken bones so that he could walk through those halls and sit at his desk, studying for a test that held no actual value, listening to a lecture on history as if they didn't just live it. It was like stepping into a separate reality, one where they had never gone through a war or heard the screams of dying friends. Kids fighting for their very lives for so long didn't have little moments like this. Soldiers didn't have finals week and prom and car shopping with your dad. In the trenches of it all, when their family had been guarded under lock and key, when the citizens huddled under UA's protection, when he and his classmates did the jobs amazing heroes were too cowardly to do, there was no looking to the future. Living was day to day, and the only future you had was the hours until you made it to morning. You fought or you died, you fought or you caused someone else to die, you fought or those children watching you with fearful eyes, barely able to even comprehend the horror before them would be out fighting instead. Hell, it had been an entire year since the final battle and he still had to force himself to think of more than just the present, of more than just survival. It was a constant struggle, but at the very least it was one he thought he was not fighting alone. So when Izuku bombarded him with lengthy messages and pictures, he had assumed the worst. Instead he saw Izuku beaming, pointing at a useless old shell and exposed motor, excited beyond reason over something objectively trivial. It was then that he realized, despite how deeply he was struggling, his camaraderie in suffering was in fact a figment of his own imagining. He just assumed that the reason it was so easy for everyone else was because they didn't have to fight the way he and Izuku did, they didn't have to be a part of the devastation of that final battle, they didn't have to fight, prepared to die, so that the rest of the world had a chance at peace. Izuku was the only other person who could understand, because only Izuku had given up as much as Katsuki had. But Izuku was happy. Izuku was smiling without having to think if it was worth the effort. Izuku was picking out cars with his dad and bubbling with glee over the dark green tint, already fantasizing about how he could sneak some bright red in without Toshinori noticing. Izuku wasn't just pretending to feel normal. Izuku was moving on. And it made him feel the same way Izuku always managed to make him feel. Humbled. Idiotic. Left behind. Katsuki's eyes returned from memory just in time to see Izuku throw his jacket over the passenger's side, keeping it from the bulk of the rain while the top whined back to life. It was a strange act, but Katsuki didn't give it too much thought. Maybe he was going to bring a date home from the reception. Maybe he was trying to make a good impression, dressed to the nines, waiting by a car he had fixed himself, growing more drenched by the moment as he patiently waited for their arrival. It was stupid either way, he was the goddamn symbol of peace. He didn't need to impress anyone. With the car now secured, Izuku relaxed beside the hood, his long scarred fingers clenching beneath the dent in anticipation. Katsuki knew he shouldn't stare, that he was dancing dangerously close to that line he'd drawn, but he couldn't force his eyes away. He wasn't used to seeing Izuku put together. Anyone would have gaped at him for a few minutes, at least anyone who knew what he normally looked like. Katsuki's parents had been in charge of clothes for the wedding party, And while that mostly meant making Inko the absolute belle of the ball, it also rippled to the loved ones who were privileged enough to stand beside them. The wedding planners had decided on jewel colors, deep greens and rich purple, soft sprinkles of tan and an almost black blue. It had all been meant to complement Inko's tone and complexion but, inadvertently, had done the same to Izuku as well. As he was the best man, his mother had chosen a peacock bow tie, real feathers, not a pattern of course. His mother wasn't a lunatic. That Katsuki had scoffed at right up until he caught a glimpse of Tashinori helping him put it on. The dork looked fantastic. Ethereal. He'd been so entranced he didn't even register the cocky smirk his reaction had garnered from his mother's face. He hated how long he stared at his stupid dancing, the way he twirled with Eri in his arms even when the music had stopped, how perfect and unbelievably overjoyed he'd been just from being surrounded by his family and friends. More than anything though, he hated how angry it made him feel, because Izuku wasn't faking any of it. It wasn't a mask, or an attempt to keep the peace by hiding his broken wounds. He had figured out how to be happy. And as terrible as it was to feel, seeing Izuku that way made him want to throw up. It irritated him, fired up in anger that he had tried to snuff since the early years the two of them had spent together. Beyond the instinct to punch that grin off his face, however, was something he didn't dare try to uncover, something he kept tight and secure, because he knew lifting that lid meant he could never close it again. So he just watched as the rain soaked through Izuku's shirt, the boy's hands nervously fiddling with the clasp on his suspenders. A part of him was afraid to move. So far Izuku hadn't noticed him, and if he stayed quiet he might be able to wait out his parents' makeout session and not bother with a long goodbye. Still, the longer he stood the more pathetic and nervous Izuku seemed to be. And though Katsuki wasn't sure why, the thought of anyone else seeing him so vulnerable made his blood race with rage. "You look like a turkey standing like that. Close your demon mouth or you'll drown," Katsuki muttered, pulling off the wall to join him. Izuku immediately stood to attention, his jaw snapping shut at his command as if he had forced the motion himself. He managed to hide a smirk as he drew closer, hands placed specifically in his pockets so he didn't look too eager. Because he wasn't. "What are you doing out here? Waiting on someone?" Katsuki questioned, motioning his head to the jacket lying across his passenger seat. "Kaken. Yeah, I guess you could say that. I was actually waiting for you." Izuku rambled, his comfortable lean turning to an all-too-practiced straight back. If it wasn't for the goofy grin plastering his cheeks, Katsuki would have said he looked ready to be scolded. Still, for a reason he didn't want to dwell on, his smirk returned. This time he didn't bother to hide it. "Oh yeah? Why is that nerd?" he asked, closing the distance between them. It made his heart pump with ego and pride to see Izuku try to stand taller. Despite his best efforts, Izuku still had to raise his eyes up to meet Katsuki's own. It had been touch and go there for a while, Katsuki only holding on to his height-winning streak by a few inches before their third year. Thankfully he'd had a bit of a growth spurt after recovering from the final battle, and while it wasn't the looming presence he had hoped for, it was enough height to be intimidating. That wasn't what he'd hoped to achieve right now though, so he wasn't quite sure why his body had made him draw so close. Izuku's face was flushed with color, no doubt from running around all night, the light red only further distinguishing his splatter of freckles along his cheeks. After a cold winter like this, some of them stayed dormant, only blossoming when he spent long hours in the sun. With such a deep blush, Katsuki could almost make out the ones that were hidden away, their soft brown hue calling for him to reach out and touch. "Oh well, I ran into Auntie and Uncle in the bathroom and, safe to say I don't think they're coming out anytime soon, so I figured I could offer you a ride home. I saw you didn't bring your bike, so..." Izuku trailed off as Katsuki's breath unconsciously hitched. He tried to hide the sudden pause, but it was clear that Izuku had seen right through it. No matter what he did, no matter how good he got at lying, Izuku was still the one person he could never fool. It would have been almost sweet if it wasn't so dim and annoying. "Yeah, these country roads are too rough to bring my bike on. I'll just wait them out, I'm not in a rush," Katsuki answered, keeping his voice as level as possible so as to not reveal anything more. Izuku might be able to tell when something was off, but it didn't mean he had to hand him the answer on a silver platter. At his words, Izuku's face dropped, not into disappointment or annoyance, but something far more lonely. Katsuki's eyes widened, taken aback by the sudden silent attack. He held up his hands, half to halt Izuku's no-doubt running thoughts and half in instinctual surrender, anything to get him to stop directing those eyes in his direction. "Hey, I didn't mean dash. You're leaving for America tonight, aren't you?" Katsuki froze, his entire body suddenly tight and stiff. Izuku just stared, his sad expression softening into a pained and defeated smile. Knew it was likely for his benefit, an attempt to lighten the image of his hurt, but somehow it only made the entire thing worse. Katsuki swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. His mind rushed with lies, ways to dissuade the boy's thoughts, to get himself out of whatever mess he'd unknowingly created, but all that stuck was the truth. "How'd you know?" he quietly muttered. "You rode here with your parents. There's no reason on earth the Kachin I know would suffer through that without there being no other choice. You can't very well park your bike at the airport, so it stands to reason someone would have to take you," Izuku answered, sounding far too logical about it all, as if it were simple, as if he were far too easy to read. "I could have just wanted to have a few drinks. We're legal now, you know," Katsuki bit back, though he knew there was no point. Izuku laughed, though there was a hollowness to it that twisted Katsuki's throat. "I thought of that actually, but for that excuse to work you'd actually have to partake in some. You haven't had a drop since you got here, I assume because you don't want to try navigating the terminals tipsy," Izuku taunted, further rubbing Katsuki's agitation. "And how would you know that? Well, were you stalking me all night?" he growled, though the bike behind it was missing. Even with his fake anger, Izuku's eyes never left him, his face softening as he returned the smile he'd lost. "Not all night," Izuku answered with a shrug. Katsuki could swear he saw the slightest bit of a blush pull at his cheeks, but before he could comment on it, Izuku was already back to rambling. "Besides, if either your bike or drinking were your real reasons for sharing a ride, you would have shown up with Kirishima or Kaminari. It was strange no matter how I looked at it. I'd hoped I was reading too much into it. But I wasn't. I was right. You're leaving tonight, and the only reason you suffered through your mom and dad carpooling was so that you didn't have to deal with us." Izuku breathed, his words growing weaker the longer he spoke, like he was running out of breath, as if the words themselves had drained him. His eyes never left Katsuki's, and it killed him. "So what? You here to lecture me for trying to take a quiet exit?" Katsuki finally managed, sounding far harsher than he wanted. To his credit, Izuku didn't falter. He kept that sad smirk along his lips, knowing that he'd won even if it was a game he didn't want to be playing. After a beat of silence, Izuku shook his head, stepping back from Katsuki's form, giving the both of them a bit of distance. Katsuki immediately felt the urge to replace it, to stay looming, nose to nose so that he couldn't be taken by surprise, so that he'd stay holding the upper hand. This wasn't a battle, but God, it felt just as dangerous. Still, he managed to keep himself away, to let Izuku stay just out of arm's reach as he leaned along the car's hood. Katsuki noted the way his hands sunk in an almost painful grip, his knuckles turning white as Izuku pushed a slow sigh out his lips. The chill mist gathered in front of his face and fell across the rainy wind, dragging like a tired and dejected dragon's roar. "No," Izuku settled, resigning himself in a way that seemed as if he'd already known the answer. "I know better than to try and talk you out of something once you've committed to it. I just wanted to offer a ride." Katsuki's eyes darted to the passenger seat covered by Izuku's jacket. "And if I say no? Planning on telling our shitty friends I'm already leaving?" Katsuki questioned, trying to find the trap in the otherwise all too easy proposition. By this point he'd expected theatrics, big droplet tears, and curses in a way only Izuku would know to make hurt. He'd expected rage for ruining what was otherwise a perfect night, for trying to slip away, for trying to run. "Nope. I may not agree with it, but if you want to do this without an audience, that's up to you, Kachin. No catch involved," Izuku assured, as always able to read his mind without provocation. Katsuki stayed silent, a lone glance shared back to the reception hall before finally settling on Izuku again. It wasn't like he was in a rush to get to the airport. He'd given himself plenty of time, especially given how finicky the old hag could be with keeping a schedule. If Izuku wasn't lying, he could just send the nerd on his way and be done with it. He'd have no problem ditching his parents at the terminal and ignoring whatever emotional baggage they tried saddling him with before he was free of it entirely. No sappy drawn-out goodbyes, no guilt for not staying behind like the rest of the class, no saddling each other with the fear of the war all over again, the panic that this might really be the last time they saw each other alive. "You gonna cry?" he mumbled, raising his head to meet Izuku's gaze. Izuku let out a laugh and it tickled the inside of Katsuki's ears in a way nothing else could. "Probably a little," he admitted bashfully. Katsuki let out a tsk, clicking his tongue as his foot found a few rocks beneath him. He stuffed his hands harshly within his pockets, unsure of what to do with them as he wordlessly moved to the passenger side. Izuku watched him curiously, as if unsure of what he was doing until the very moment Katsuki threw open the door. "Whatever, let's just go. It's a long drive, so I'll give you some gas money or some sheet." Izuku stared at him with wide eyes before nodding with his usual dumb expression, his hands practically sliding off the handle with nerves as he hitched himself into the driver's seat. Katsuki hadn't been lying when he said the drive would be a long one. The wedding and reception had been held at a rose garden hours away from the city, allowing them to be surrounded by tall trees and a sort of quiet that only the countryside could offer. Though a few hours was hardly unbearable, most had chosen to stay at a hotel for the night and take in all that the villa had to offer. After being found out, Katsuki had been certain that the hours of travel were going to drag. Izuku would either fill the time with pointless, endless conversation or silently punish him by stewing in tense, punishing quiet. He found himself surprised a second time that night when it turned out to be neither. Izuku drove through the night roads with no real necessity or rush. Their conversation was easy, natural, the silence comfortable and safe. The longer the road went on without any sudden surprises or attacks, the further Katsuki relaxed, the drain of the past few months finally leaving him. His eyes closed, and though he knew Izuku could see it, the boy made no effort to wake him. He had prepared himself for Izuku to be mad, to feel betrayed that Katsuki was leaving him. He'd been waiting for his lashing ever since he'd announced his final choice of agency, a choice he'd specifically waited until the last minute to tell. By the way Izuku's face dropped and paled, he thought it was coming right then and there, but he'd stayed quiet and eventually found a smile to congratulate him. It felt sickening. Despite being the one to apply for jobs abroad, all he wanted in that moment was for Izuku to tell him how stupid he was being, how much stronger they were together, how they'd done only amazing things since they'd chosen to fight at each other's side instead of at one another. It was an obsessive craving, needing Izuku to tear him apart as desperately as a desert needed water. Which was the reason he'd needed this break to begin. But music's not actually half bad, he quietly muttered, the exhaustion clear within his figure. Considering it was Izuku's mother's wedding day, he'd expected the car to be loaded with gooey romantic ballads or blaring pop songs of true love and all its majesty. Instead, steady hums and deep melodies of heartbreak and loneliness reverberated throughout the speakers. It was cathartic in a way, though Katsuki would never voice that part. "Thank you. Jiro made it for me, said it could help me sort through some sheet," Izuku informed, his cheery voice a stark contrast to the agonizing crack of the worn singer screaming through his guitar. Katsuki peeked an eye open, trying to hide his amusement. "Yeah? What sort of sheet does a nerd like you have to be sorting? I mean, besides your childhood hero shacking up with your mom. Because personally, I don't think there are enough songs in the world to make that CRP make sense." He muttered. "Actually, I'm in pretty high spirits about the wedding. Not specifically the shacking up part, but it's good to see Mom happy, to see both of them happy," Izuku assured, and somehow Katsuki could see that he meant it. He rolled his eyes, unsure of how that could be true. Relaxing in his seat, he crossed his arms along his chest, harboring in his self-made heat. "Yeah, we always knew All Might was your dad. It's just taken him this long to go and make it official," he reasoned, to which Izuku gave an eager nod, eyes still stuck to the road. "He wanted to adopt me, you know?" Katsuki sat up a bit straighter, having never heard this new bit of information. "Tonight?" he questioned, earning a soft laugh from Izuku. "No," his gentle laugh fell short as he looked over to Katsuki, his nerves slowly creeping back to the surface, their short stay at a light giving him the chance to meet the boy's eyes for the first time. Katsuki could see the flashes of recollection, the memory tightening his otherwise relaxed form. Subconsciously his fingers played with the steering wheel, giving him something to focus on other than the man at his side. No, it was after that big battle with All for One. You know, the one we... His words fell short, but Katsuki knew exactly what battle he was referring to. It wasn't exactly easy to forget, the battle, the one Katsuki had lost his heart to, the one he and Izuku nearly died in, the one All for One had died in. We'd purposefully led the battle away from civilization as much as possible, so when I was taken to the hospital, well, it took a while to pass the message that I was hurt to my mom. They needed signatures for surgeries and treatment and, basically everything they had to do to keep me alive. They kept trying to get Hisashi to come in since, unbeknownst to me, he was actually closer, but you know how he is. Izuku's eyes glazed, the mention of his bearded father putting a coldness to the air that even Katsuki could not heat. Anyway, Toshinori was there. He'd followed after us in the fight. He was one of the first ones to find us when the dust had cleared. He was at my side the whole time, but when it came to keeping me alive, he could be little more than a spectator. He just felt so powerless. He watched me flatline again and again, watched how much harder it was to get me back with each setback. He had to sit there, holding me, scared out of his skin that Hisashi would get there first, that he'd decide it wasn't worth the effort, that he'd pull the plug, leaving me to rot. He looked for every loophole in the book, but in the end, legally, he had no say. Izuku's white-gripped knuckles sank into the leather steering wheel, only relaxing when Izuku began to temper his breathing. Deep down he's always known he was my father in the ways that mattered, but it was the first time that wasn't enough. So when I woke up, he asked if it would be okay to adopt me, Izuku explained, suddenly feeling Katsuki's full attention on him. He nervously laughed, not understanding the sudden stare. I mean, I was turning 18 soon anyways, so it wouldn't have made much of a difference. In a few years blood wouldn't decide who knew what was best for me, he wouldn't need a paper to know he was always the most important. He rambled, but Katsuki sat at full attention now, a sharp contrast from the lazed posture he had only moments before. You never told me that, Katsuki whispered, so quiet Izuku almost wasn't sure it had come from him. Which part? Izuku hastily questioned. That you died. Izuku's blood ran cold as his fingers tightened on the wheel. He was suddenly very grateful that the light chose then to spare him, forcing them back into motion so that he did not have to face Katsuki fully. Oh, yeah, I guess not. It wasn't malicious or anything, it's just by the time I regained consciousness the doctors agreed the hard part was over and there was little risk of it happening again. It's not like I remembered it happening or anything, so I didn't think to bring it up. Izuku rambled, incredibly thankful when Katsuki's eyes lowered, his back settling once more into the curve of his seat. They sat in silence like that for a time before Katsuki's voice eventually broke through. So, what did you say? Say to what? Katsuki rolled his eyes, as if the question couldn't be any more obvious. To when he asked to adopt you. Oh. Izuku straightened in surprise, having thought the discussion to be over. As it was a rather stark departure from talking about his momentary brushes with death, however, Izuku was quick to refocus his attention. Well, to be honest, I was on a lot of painkillers at the time, so I think I asked him if I was in heaven? I mean, All Might asking if I'd be okay being his son? Huh? Yeah, that was some perfect world simulation material if I'd ever seen one. He tried again later when I was a little more together, and I guess I just told him the truth. I said that I was flattered and shocked and obviously over the moon, but the paper didn't matter to me. He'd done what my dad never bothered to. He'd stuck around. At the last sentence, Katsuki could feel his breathing cracking, all too aware that Izuku no doubt viewed his own choice to leave as an abandonment. He knew Izuku too well to think he'd done it on purpose, but the thought twisted itself in his chest, making his heart LBR and his lungs shudder with cold. Thankfully, whatever pain it had caused went unnoticed as Izuku squinted his vision, carefully following the cars in front of him as he merged into oncoming traffic. I think we both knew it just wasn't the right time. After everything that had happened, I know most of us didn't even dream we'd live to see graduation, so now that all of it was finally over, well, it's not an overstatement to say we were all riding a pretty big high. He was being sincere in the moment, but I just didn't want him to rush to a decision because he'd almost lost me. I told him once I was 18 and he and my mom had come to an agreement, I'd be more than happy to be his son. Neither of us is worried about it. If that day comes, it'll come, Izuku stated, idly shrugging. He will want you to be his son, I mean, Katsuki assured, but Izuku's half-vacant stare confessed that he wasn't so confident. I hope so. Katsuki watched Izuku for a while after that, glad that he had grown so focused with humming along to the remaining playlist that his sudden study went unnoticed. Katsuki fought the urge to poke his face as Izuku's teeth clenched along the flesh of his cheek, something he always did when he was lost in focus. Izuku had always been the sort that wore his heart on his shoulders, the one who cried freely and didn't bother to hide his happiness or affection. On the rare occasions he did lie, Katsuki always knew it. He'd known it when he was lying about One for All, and he'd known he was lying when he said those months alone as a vigilante didn't really affect him. He knew he was lying when he hid away his night terrors, when he said that Shigaraki's death didn't weigh on him, or when he told Katsuki he was happy he'd gotten the agency spot that he'd wanted. Izuku was terrified. He could see it as easily as if the man had screamed it at the top of his lungs, but even with it so obvious he never revealed the truth. He kept up the lie from friend to friend, from paralyzing fear to the next, as he learned just how many would no longer be within reach, just how many were leaving him behind. You sure you want to waste your first year as a graduate training with Aizawa? Katsuki suddenly questioned, raising a brow to Izuku as his eyes squinted in concentration. You know you don't have to, right? You're pretty much the most capable hero there is, besides me, of course. If you're that worried about leaving Auntie, it's not like there aren't local agencies you can apply to. I'm not going to be satisfied with taking the #1 slot first just because you got a late start, you know, Katsuki tested, watching Izuku's reaction as a quiet laugh escaped his lips. It sounded tired. I'm sure, Izuku answered, and at least that much he wasn't lying about. So much of my high school life was just adapting to what was happening around me. I was getting stronger, sure, but it was just getting strong enough to handle the power, getting just fast enough to avoid being captured, becoming just competent enough to hold my own if the League managed to find me. Then in the war, well, that all of that effort only had one goal, beating All for One, no matter the cost. Every technique I've learned with my new powers, every new ounce of strength or strategy was tailored to taking him down. Izuku trailed off before growing coherent of Katsuki's growing stare. And I'm not complaining, he nervously laughed. It was important. The most important thing, at least at the time. And it worked. We made One for All just powerful enough to quiet All for One forever. He trailed off, but Katsuki understood. Before I put myself out there as a proper hero, I think I need to learn how to use these powers to actually help, to find out exactly how many ways I can save and rescue the lives of the people who are trusting in me. I could sign as I am now, but out in the real world, with real lives on the line, well, it's not the place to be testing out new techniques. When I debut, I want it to be as the most prepared version of myself I can be. A few years here or there is nothing in the grand scheme of things. I'm just grateful Mr. Aizawa agreed to it. You're lucky All Might didn't take offense to you not asking him first, Katsuki reminded. Izuku laughed with a sigh, nodding in silent thought. It would have already been hard enough hurting the feelings of his mentor. The last thing he needed was a sad stepdad on top of that. All Might was an incredible teacher, but I think he and I both know he's not the person I need for this sort of training. Even if I had asked him, he would have probably just recommended someone else instead. Being away from him, from my mom, is going to be hard. But I know that it's for the best. It'll give them time to be alone as a couple instead of, well, my parents. Still, I've never been on my own for so long before, Izuku mused. At least I'll have Mr. Yamada and Eri to keep me company when I'm not training with Mr. Aizawa, of course. Katsuki nodded, letting the matter drop, though he still wasn't sure that he agreed. Izuku had done too much work keeping the world safe for him to just drop off the radar. He knew that it would only be a year, 2 at max, but people's attention could be fickle. Within a few news cycles, a few natural disasters, a few new police busts, the public would move on from the amazing victory of Hero Deku to whatever lame new hero popped on their feeds. Sure, he'd always have fans of the people he personally saved, but the general population could hardly be expected to wait for his re-emergence, especially with so many prominent faces debuting from UA that year. Whatever his thoughts, Izuku's decisions had nothing to do with him, and if he said he needed more time to train, then he'd let the matter drop, at least for now. He wasn't sure where the time had gone, only that in the blink of an eye the peaceful country had been replaced by city lights, long open roads molded into crammed highways until they were funneled through airport terminals. Katsuki didn't say anything when Izuku turned to park. It would be faster to just drop him off at the terminal, and it wasn't as if he wanted Izuku to come in with him, but he kept quiet. He wasn't in a rush after all. Shoot, did we totally space out on your bags? I didn't even think about getting them from Auntie's car dash, Izuku hissed, quickly growing frazzled as Katsuki rolled his eyes. I wouldn't forget that sheet. I have my phone and my paperwork on me, I don't need anything else. The agency's taking care of all that. Izuku immediately relaxed, whispering some sort of thank goodness under his breath before hurrying to meet Katsuki's stride. It should have annoyed him that Izuku didn't even bother asking if it was okay to come to the terminal with him. He'd already foiled his quiet departure by figuring out his plan. The least he could do was pretend to give Katsuki the option of doing this alone. Still, he wasn't surprised that he couldn't muster the energy. It was why he'd picked his parents to be the unlucky few taking him. They might have given BRH and life to him, but he wouldn't feel any sort of pity leaving them crying outside the airport windows. Well, maybe a little. He wasn't heartless after all. Not anymore. The thought of doing the same to Izuku, however, put his mind in a full stop, unable to even conjure the image by how impossible it would prove to be. So, keeping his hands in his pockets, he walked beside him leisurely, glad for the dark cover of night otherwise skewing Izuku's features. He didn't know what the man was thinking, was certain he didn't want to, but his gaze floundered under every street light, lingered when the beam of passing cars bounced off his skin. Izuku was uncharacteristically quiet through their short walk. Maybe he was as afraid as Katsuki to break the silence, to test and shatter whatever comfortable air had settled between them. The last thing he wanted to do before he left was say something stupid he'd later regret, an inevitability if Katsuki let his mouth run for too long. Izuku was probably thinking the same thing, though for very different reasons. It wasn't like Izuku had to worry about pushing someone away. He was too kind, too honest. He would never say something he didn't mean out of anger, would never call him names that held no actual truth in his heart. He'd never have such a disgusting secret, never be forced to create invisible lines so that his intentions would never be found out. It felt like he blinked and they were suddenly in front of airport security. He didn't remember entering the building, let alone walking this far in. How long had he been standing here, staring at the few feet that would decidedly separate them from one another, going somewhere Izuku could not follow. Thanks for the ride, nerd. Don't drive stupid on the way back just 'cause I'm not there to lecture you, Katsuki muttered, feeling out of body as the words fell from his lips. His muscles were doing what his brain could not, forcing space that he didn't want to leave, moving away when he just wanted to stand still. He was thankful for it, not sure he'd have the strength to force it himself, only to be caught by Izuku's warm grip, seconds before he could vanish away. Katsuki turned his eyes down to Izuku's scarred fingers, heat brewing in his chest at how pitifully they shook despite the death grip he'd managed to snake. He stared down at Izuku's shoes, certain that meeting his gaze at that moment would be the death of him. He didn't pull away though, couldn't, not until Izuku let him go on his own. He may have had the courage to leave, but that's where his strength died. Forcing Izuku back, prying apart his fingers to leave him alone and crying was just beyond what he was capable. Hey! Katsuki breathed, but Izuku didn't listen. If he could have physically thrown his hands over his ears without letting go of Katsuki's arm, he would have, desperate to drown out whatever logic or assurances Katsuki could give. He had to let go, of course he did. He couldn't keep Katsuki here forever, no matter how much stronger he'd grown over the years. He could maybe tackle him into a fight, keep him back long enough to miss his plane, but what about the next one? Or the one after that? Katsuki's warm hand moved across Izuku's and the green-haired boy bit back a sob. Half throwing himself forward, half dragging Katsuki closer, Izuku abandoned his hold to throw his arms around Katsuki's frame, clinging to him in the most rib-crushing embrace he'd ever dared to give. Katsuki didn't even flinch. "Kachin, why are you really doing this? Why are you?" His quiet breath hitched and Katsuki could tell he was close to crying. "I know what you told everyone else, but it's just me now, so, please, I need to know the reason, I need to know why you're really leaving me." Katsuki flinched, unable to ignore the hurt in his words. Normally he'd tear the boy a new one for being so egotistical as to assume his choice in agency had anything to do with him, that he would pick anything short of the greatest, no matter whose feelings it hurt, but that wasn't the truth. It was what he said. It was what he repeated enough times that even he had begun to believe it. But it wasn't honest. So why was he doing this? Because I'm getting complicit. Because I'm changing. Because I'm feeling things that I don't know how to control. Because every time I see you get hurt I lose my goddamn mind. Because the idea of you choosing to be anywhere but by my side makes me want to jump out of my skin. Because without school forcing us together you will make that choice. Because I'm only getting stronger when I'm beside you. Because you're getting stronger whether I'm there or not. Because I'm afraid of being this codependent. Because I need to prove that I can do this without you. Because I want to, Katsuki whispered, trying not to think how easy such lies had become. I want to travel and it's a good opportunity and all that. It's not forever. Besides, you'll be fighting bears in the wilderness or some shit. It's not like you'll even have time to miss me. You'll come back, right? You're coming back. Izuku pleaded, his nails practically tearing away at the flesh beneath his shirt. Of course I am. I've got to make sure I get the #1 spot here too. Katsuki snapped, his own arm lazily falling behind Izuku's neck, limp along his shoulders so that Izuku could feel his own resolve. At the simple touch, the confirmation of even this small affection, Izuku broke down in sobs. He hid his face away, not daring to let Katsuki go as Katsuki slowly squeezed him in turn, pulling his messy mop of hair tight to his chest. In a moment of weakness, Katsuki leaned his chin against Izuku's head, soaking in the feel of his warmth, the gentle sweetness of his scent. Promise me you'll come back," Izuku begged. Katsuki's fingers idly smoothed down his hair, offering what little comfort he knew to do. "All right, I promise. Geez, it's just a year in America, Deku. You act like I'm going off to war or something," Katsuki mumbled, though he knew he needed to hear it just as much as Izuku did. He wouldn't be gone for long. He wouldn't be gone forever. He just needed to do this on his own, win or lose. "I love you." Katsuki's throat ran dry as those words tumbled out of Izuku's mouth. He blinked a few times to reset himself, as if he might have heard it incorrectly before realization finally replaced the tunnel vision. Of course Izuku loved him. They had been friends since they were toddlers, they'd survived a war together, they'd been inseparable even when space was all Katsuki was ever trying to get. He told him he loved him all the time as a child. He was always saying how amazing he was, how incredible. His Kachin. It had only stopped because Katsuki had threatened to kick his teeth in if he ever said it again. He hadn't meant it, hadn't really wanted him to stop, but he couldn't say that now. Izuku deserved thousands of things to make up for how he'd overreacted as a middle schooler, but lame half-butted excuses weren't one of them. "You love everyone," Katsuki gently reminded. Izuku's hands somehow grew tighter, more feverish, his knuckles flashing black with the aura of his power. Had they not been in the middle of an airport, Katsuki was certain he'd be using One for All to close the pinprick of distance between them. "I mean it. I love you, Kachin," Izuku sobbed, words as messy and choked as his face. Katsuki didn't dare lift Izuku's head away. He knew he couldn't handle whatever expression lay upon it. Yeah, I get it. Me too, I guess. Now stop crying, you're gonna get snot all over my shirt," Katsuki lectured, allowing his eyes to close as he whispered the words into Izuku's hair. He allowed himself a slip-up, allowed his lips to graze against the top of his head before he replaced it with his chin. The airport was quiet, empty, still in a way that made it feel they were the only two people in the world. Izuku's sobs mingled with laughter, but his grip didn't loosen. The fear of letting him go, of giving any inch of space was riddled within his form, muscles tight, ready for a fight that he knew he had no way to win. Eventually, he would have to secede. Eventually, Katsuki would have to push him away. For now though, Katsuki didn't force him. For now he rested his head on top of Izuku's as he cried, the reality of it all coming down in crushing waves. For now Katsuki waited, not daring to be the first one to let go. He had time. Chapter 2. The Intervention. I think that you should take a break. Katsuki felt his body go numb as the words rolled across his supervisor's lips. When she'd asked him to see her in her office after patrol, he had been sure he knew what to expect. It wasn't like this was a new occurrence after all. Katsuki, despite his many good qualities, was known to be a bit rougher around the edges than most. His quirk, even when expertly controlled, was destructive and left more property damage than the company desired. Add on to that his profanity tax from the news networks, and the cost of Katsuki's upkeep was spiraling into a rather hefty number. Beyond the sunk cost, he was difficult to temper. He tended to get frustrated faster than the other heroes, and he knew that it didn't exactly take much to completely set him off. As such, he'd often find himself here, getting yet another scolding about keeping himself in check and minding his public image. It wasn't something he was proud of, knowing that he'd somehow regressed from his time in UA, but it was the truth. Even after the leaps and bounds he'd already managed, some lessons still had trouble getting through his DMN head. He wished he could say that it wasn't his fault. Making it on his own in America had proved more difficult than he'd hoped. He'd known enough English before moving to get by day to day, but comforting and assuring victims, conveying orders succinctly and quickly had been an early hurdle. He'd never had a way with words, even in his native language, so trying to improve that skill in a foreign country with a culture and laws completely different than his own had proven to be frustrating. It didn't matter though. Katsuki never backed down from a challenge, and though it felt humiliating to be back to hitting the books on his off hours and weekends, he was nothing if not a quick study. It turned out, however, that language was not the largest barrier he had yet to face. America's differing market had been both a blessing and a curse. Japan had always had a suffocating air of formality, a politeness and set of unspoken rules that were never to be broken, regardless of how asinine the process actually was. Respect was less about being earned and more an expectation, even when that respect was enabling a really shitty behavior. As such, it was mostly kids and moody teenagers who were drawn to Katsuki's unique personality and way of fighting. He was rebellious and loud, and Katsuki couldn't care less about people who didn't like it. That wasn't exactly the sort of hero Japan wanted representing them though, especially after such a recent upset to how the world viewed heroes as a whole. If he tried to be number one, which he would be going against heroes whose entire identity revolved around the conventional Japanese way of thinking. There were only so many heroic stunts he could pull off before he had to legitimately dig into the business side of things and consider his optics. Japan didn't want someone like him acting as the face of the country, not when they had pretty boy Shoto or persistent rule follower Ida to choose from, ignoring the most obvious, baby-faced, freckled hero of course. To succeed in Japan, he would not only have to be a good hero, he would have to, publicly at least, be someone who agreed with the current status quo. And even then, the moment he changed enough to appeal to the Japanese government, he would lose his popularity with the people. He was a symbol of rebellion, of change. The minute he found himself on top, his entire appeal would be fundamentally damaged. Here he didn't have to worry about that so much. Americans found him brutish and rude, sure, but it was less of a career ender here. They liked that he spoke his mind, that he was independent, and got riled up when the mission got interesting. He was a bad boy, which, despite the literal translation, had ended up being a good thing. Here, the line between being a part of a community and being a part of the nation were two completely different hemispheres. He could be the best, the one who protected everyone, without automatically being seen as complicit with the way the law was run. It wasn't like the whole DMN country was drooling at his feet, but his reputation was stable and his work spoke for itself. The problem was that every time he thought about the future, about returning home, the glaring flaw of his transfer burned itself into the back of his mind. No matter how high he climbed in the rankings, no matter how much respect and power he earned, it would mean nothing once he moved back. Sure, he'd have his statistics, his hard evidence and data or whatever other logistical nonsense went into evaluating a hero's worth, but it would mean nothing if he didn't blow away the competition, if there was absolutely no room for debate that he was the best. It was an issue for another time. If he was going to have to make that change, he was going to do it from as high on the rankings as possible, with as many saves as possible, and as many arrests. He'd make looking down on him a crime, make the whole country change to better suit him if that's what he had to do. He would be number one, and he'd do it without buckling to a system that had catastrophically already failed him. He wasn't there yet. He knew how to be a hero, how to use his quirk and use it well, but despite years of practice, his temper was still not yet under his complete control. He was brash, and his anger had always been a problem, but it never translated on the field, not when it mattered anyway. His agency understood that. They knew exactly how much potential he had, and how hard he'd work to get there. All someone had to do was give him the chance. At least he thought they had. What? He finally replied, breaking the silence between them. Go home, to Japan. You haven't visited since you took on the internship, right? Maybe now is a good time, his supervisor repeated. His dark red eyes grew dangerous, his form growing tense despite how casual her own body language seemed to be. Why? He hissed, grinding his teeth together to keep from screaming. Only you could make something as simple as a vacation a effendi argument. She breathed, sighing in exasperation as her hand rose to her head, pinching away a growing migraine, one he had undoubtedly been the cause of. The agency's head, Blaze, was no stranger to ambition. Only in her late 30s, she was one of the youngest pros to be running a 5-star merit agency, an agency she had built from the ground up after the fallout of Star's sudden passing. Blaze's agency already represented 4 of the country's top 20 heroes, despite its limited budget and smaller roster. She had a burning drive and a no-bullshit personality, something that had drawn him to her, the reason that he had chosen her offer in the first place. After the Heroes' War, as it would come to be known, Katsuki had his fill of offers. The final battle had been broadcast live, the innocents and civilians huddled in shelters as they watched the fate of the world be decided. Their hard-won victory was written down in the archives of history, his name, his face, famous, not just in his hometown or among Yude, but the entire DMN world. Izuku had been officially named the one to take down All for One, to land the last blow, but recruiters were trained to know talent when they saw it. Not that their involvement had gone without its own backlash. He still remembered the half-whispered conversations of his teachers, the barely hidden debates of ethics in allowing children to fight in a war of the adults' making. In the end, none of it had mattered, and no one had been given a choice. If they wanted to ensure a future for themselves, for the entire world, they needed to fight. And fight they did. Everyone had watched as they put their lives on the line, as they surpassed their limits and evolved beneath the pressure. Students, children, were out doing what the pros could not, what they didn't have the courage to achieve. They fought with no expectation of fame or riches, just the burning motivation to do good, to keep their people alive. After that, anywhere in the world he wanted to go would prove to be no obstacle. Perks that even veteran heroes dreamed of were willingly offered to him on a silver platter. Money, housing, tech, none of it was out of the question, all he had to do was ask. But it had been Blaze's offer he'd accepted, Blaze that he'd trusted. Is this because of that last mission with the NYPD? Look, I told those fuckers the building was going down, it's not my fault they were all slow as F-. If I didn't go in there myself, a hell of a lot of people would be dead. Sheet, I know you said to play nice, but it's not like it's an ego thing. I'm not just gonna stand back and let people burn because the FING police aren't prepared to do their job. Katsuki rambled. The entire ordeal had also sent him skyrocketing from 18th place in the rankings to 11th, but he held that bit back. After all, it wasn't like he was thinking of the ratings when he'd done it. He'd disobeyed their stupid orders because they were just that stupid. They had tried to stop him from going in because the building wasn't safe, as if that wasn't the exact FING reason he needed to get into the building. If a pro hero couldn't navigate the crumbling structure, what hope did the injured civilians inside have? And you don't think assuming you know better than the safety coordinators doesn't tie back to your ego? Blaze prodded, raising her brow. Katsuki huffed, crossing his arms in agitation. Alright, well maybe he did value his own opinion higher than others, but that didn't actually change anything. Even if the NYPD had been right, that he was risking his life by going into unnecessary danger, that wasn't their call to make. They weren't telling him the risk because they actually cared, they were making it clear they wouldn't be following after to save him if he found himself in trouble. That made his choice simple. Either he failed and he died with all of the others left inside, or he saved as many as he could and still possibly got himself killed in the process. In his mind that equation was a no-brainer. After all, he would rather die because he was wrong than let civilians die because he was right. That's not the point. If you want to punish me, give me the shitty overnight shifts or dock my pay, whatever, just, I'm not stopping, not now, not when I'm so close, Katsuki argued. Bakugo dash. No. You know well I can't just take a break, or vacation, or whatever lame but word you want to use to try and convince me. I signed with you because I thought you understood what I want. You were the one who told me you could help me get it, Katsuki continued, his voice darkening despite his efforts to keep his voice even. From the start he'd only had one goal, one condition. He was going to be number one and he was going to do it before Deku. That meant no starting out as a sidekick, no quietly taking minor missions while those with seniority took first pick, no unnecessary media and ribbon cutting, and above all, no deadweight partner taking half the glory. Surprisingly, it was only the last point that Blaze had ever fought him on, but it was also the only thing Katsuki knew he couldn't let budge. After all, having a partner, having someone he relied on was the entire reason he was in this mess. He'd let himself become soft and codependent, complicit. There were other reasons that didn't tie directly back to Izuku, but his end goal was the same. He had to make a name for himself, one that wasn't influenced by anyone else's screw-ups. He already had years of mistakes to undo. Normally, having a pre-established reputation before making your debut was a good thing, but he and Class 1A's journey had never exactly been normal. They had been a big part of bringing the Heroes' War to a close, and while news of that obviously spanned globally, it didn't change the fact that most agencies in Japan had known of him far before that final battle, far before he'd even procured his hero's license. From being consumed by that DMN sludge monster, kidnapped by the League, and the monstrous battles that were quick to follow, Japan had been watching him fight since he was a literal child. And it wasn't just the agencies, anyone paying attention to the news had watched him win, watched him lose, watched him scream and cry and bleed out over the battle's floor. Had watched him die. It was yet another reason he knew he couldn't stay. He had to get a clean slate, one without pity or charity or... Izuku's smile filled his vision. Katsuki violently shook his head, clearing the remnants of memory into splices of the present. It wouldn't be enough to be number one. He had to do it without help from anyone else, and he had to do it faster than anyone thought possible. If he couldn't do that, if he couldn't at least manage that much on his own, what right did he have to go back there? What right did he have to look them in the eye and say that he... Bakugo, Blaze called, only for Katsuki to grunt in frustration, slamming his chair to the side. Her audible groan of frustration could barely be made out over the grinding of his teeth, his breathing short and taut, lungs barely able to begin his trained de-escalation before his temper took over. He couldn't stop now, not yet. He was so DMN close, and the only reason he had that was because he'd refused to give anyone else an inch. In only a few years, Dynamite had gone from his hero debut to 11th in the charts. A part of that would always be because of what he'd done during the Heroes' War, but a majority of the citizens in the States had been entirely clueless to his past before he started working under Blaze. He had given himself the lowest footing possible and he'd still blown his competition out of the water. A few more years of pushing, a few more years of nothing but training and fighting, a few more years of sacrifice and he'd have the number one spot secured, years ahead of any pro hero before him. Then he could... Bakugo, Blaze snapped, forcing his eyes to shift to hers in attention. When she was sure that he had calmed down enough to listen, she sighed, motioning for him to take a seat in the untoppled chair opposite of her. Her eyes narrowed impatiently until he reluctantly dropped down into the seat, arms already crossed in rolling irritation. In the 5 years that you have been under my care, you've volunteered for every holiday shift, every long night, every scrap of overtime you could possibly accumulate, and not once have you ever let yourself have more than an obligatory long weekend when we are overstaffed. Even though I've told you several times to take a vacation, to go do something other than work, you have never listened, Blaze began, but Katsuki's mind stuttered, stuck on her first sentence. It hadn't been that long, had it? Sure, he hadn't taken time off exactly, and yes, he was the first to volunteer for anything that might improve his numbers, but that didn't make him an anomaly. Tons of new heroes threw themselves into their work after they debuted. It was the best time to get your name out there, to really shock people and show them what you could do. He doubted that anyone from his class was doing anything differently, those lunatics just as focused as him on putting the trust back into a hero's title. Still, panic clutched at Katsuki's throat. 5 years? He'd known he'd gone beyond the year that he originally promised, but that was just because America had proven to fit him very well. It was a surprise, and not something he had planned for, but he was leaving an impact, and Blaze had filled a role in his life he hadn't been aware he'd been missing. He was important here, he was needed, and it was intoxicating. She was right that he hadn't returned home yet, but there had just never been a right time, not with the undercover missions and the big corporation takedowns. At first it had been excusable. He was an intern in a big city where crime never took a paid holiday. The logistics of trying to fly back, even for a night, was near impossible, and while his parents hadn't been happy about it, they had understood. After all, even with their professions being so different, Katsuki hadn't gotten his competitive streak from nowhere. They'd logged countless long hours to grow their brand, many of them jammed into those beginning years. Maybe they thought he'd calm down once he found a partner or got his foot in the door, but somewhere along the line they'd just given up trying to schedule time home and instead just brought home to him. It was never more than a few days at a time, Katsuki managing to squeeze them in on his brief days off or between traded shifts. Without having to worry about his parents complaining, the months had just started melding together, overgrowing and letting him forget that there was anyone else still waiting to hear he was alive back in Japan. His fingers twitched as he felt the urge to suddenly check the call log of his phone. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard any of their voices. How long had it been? The longer his mind was empty of memories, the more his blood ran cold. His old one had been destroyed a few years back, along with Katsuki's skull. After the hospital, he'd gotten a new one with a new number, but for the life of him he couldn't remember if he'd ever actually told anyone that. Despite how hot he normally ran, an unconscious chill shuddered down his spine. Had he really managed to F up so royally? Sure, he carried around a calloused attitude and sharp exterior, but that didn't mean he'd meant to go radio silent for literal years. How long had it been since he'd checked in on any of the extras? He remembered a time they'd call every day, but, even when he should have been trying, when was the last time he'd bothered to pick up? Listen, you've got ambition and a hell of a drive, I know that, and maybe part of this is on me. At the end of the day, it's not just my job to supervise you but to help you become the best hero that you can. I wanted you to be number one and I wanted to get you there at your own pace, but I think somewhere along the way I let things slide that I shouldn't have. I let you be untethered and didn't step in even when I saw you making the same mistakes I did at your age, Blaze continued, knowing eyes taking in his flash of expression as he realized the weight of what she was trying to do. With a heavy breath, she allowed a part of her stony exterior to break, to chip down from the higher hero to the vulnerable human just beneath. Truth be told, I'm worried about you, kid. You're falling off the rails, and if I'm being honest, the scary part is I don't think you've even noticed, Blaze quietly confessed. At that, Katsuki tensed, his mind snapping back into defense as whatever walls he'd let fall came shooting back into place. Shock warped to anger and contempt, his fist slamming against the wooden desk between them. I'm running laps around the competition dash, he hissed, but Blaze stood as well, not backing down from his hate-filled glare. You're pushing yourself too hard. You're being unpredictable on the field and isolating yourself from your comrades. You never listen when I say to walk away and clear your head, and what little control you did have over your temper when I signed you here has completely disappeared. You continuously put yourself in unnecessary risk and only take orders when it suits you. You don't have any other outlet than work, you refuse to see a doctor or therapist despite several instances of literal breakdowns, you don't talk to me, you don't talk to your fellow heroes. Hell, I can't even remember the last time you've interacted with anyone in our agency for anything other than signatures on paperwork. Blaze listed, but Katsuki was hearing none of it. And you and I both know that taking a break right now means undoing months of work, possibly years. If anyone from the press catches me having a good time while my competition is taking down the villains, do you think they'll care? Or do you think they'll take the first chance they get to stir up their sheet? I didn't get this far by sitting on my butt, so no way in hell. I'm this effing close and you think I'm gonna stop right before the finish line? Katsuki spat. He growled, pulling at his hair as he paced the short distance of her desk. What? You're mad I don't do all this bonding CRP? I'll go to the DMN Christmas party, I'll cook something for the potluck, hell, I'll go get drunk with you and the extras the night I hit the top 10, but I'm not FANG this up, not now. Katsuki growled. I'm worried about you. You don't know anything about me. Katsuki screeched, the smoke and sharp crackles betraying the uncontrolled burst of power springing from his clenched hands. Blaze's eyes lowered to them but blessedly said nothing further. Shaking her head, she lowered herself back into her chair. This time off is not a request, she repeated, her voice growing more firm. Katsuki watched as she took a folder from her desk and pushed it forward. His eyes darkened, but the fire that had been feeding him cooled to an ember, present and burning, but hidden from view. The burst of anger that had been fueling him retreated, morphing into something dark and removed, his movement emotionless as he pushed the folder back at her. Whatever. You have to do what's best for the agency. If I'm too much of a liability, then fine, fire me, but look me in the effing eyes and just get on with it. Contrary to what you think, I don't actually enjoy being here 24/7, Katsuki muttered. Bakugo, I'm not firing you, sheet kid, I'm trying to save you. Blaze groaned, her eyes rolling as she let out a small sigh of frustration. You've always been brash, but you've never been so reckless. You're cocky, rightfully so, but you're forgetting what it's like to hesitate, to be afraid and reason through 1,000 solutions that don't involve you running directly into the line of fire. You look at a dangerous situation and no longer balance what it will mean if your actions go south, Blaze whispered. So you're punishing me for being a hero? For not being afraid? Cut the sheet, you know I'd never put someone else in danger. What about yourself? Blaze shouted. Katsuki flinched, for once silenced as he felt the woman's fiery eyes bore into his own. Why doesn't it matter to you that what you're doing constantly puts you at risk? Why don't you care that you're gambling with your own DMN life every time you go running off on your own? Your first solution to an impossible scenario should not be sacrifice and martyrdom. Why have you stopped caring if this job finally kills you? He just didn't. Why should it matter? He couldn't honestly think of a reason. Look, you're right, at the end of the day I know you aren't doing this to hog all of the glory or because you think you're better than you are. It's why I let it slide for so long, why I believed you when said you were alright even when you clearly weren't. But, after that last mission? Her eyes hazed with the recollection and Katsuki could swear there was a wetness growing in her eyes. Though, that had to be a hallucination. Blaze wouldn't cry over something so stupid, over something so unworthy of her time. No matter how much he told himself that though, when Blaze spoke next it was choked and unsteady. Every day I send you out there and I wonder if it's finally going to be the one that catches up with you. If this is the day that my negligence is going to get you killed, she breathed. Katsuki averted his eyes even as she stared upon him. He didn't want to see the worry there, the genuine fear. Blaze wasn't his mother. It wasn't her job to keep him from ignoring the risk. He'd done his time in training, had already been forced to weigh the cost of his life and that of innocent civilians. He'd seen what happens when a hero was selfish, when they were careful. He could still remember the crumbling, the mass graves, the smell of burning bodies, all because the heroes had decided their lives were too important to throw away. Because they decided that stepping aside and watching it fall apart was better than trying and failing. If I die, then it's my own DMN fault. It means I wasn't strong enough. The world doesn't need weaklings and they sure as hell don't need them playing at being heroes. I've come this far on my own, I might as well go out the same way. Blaze stared at him for a long time, the two caught in the unspoken silence, the confirmation of her fears faced against the admittance that Katsuki had no intention of easing them. When it was clear he had nothing more to say, Blaze slowly shook her head, taking the folder once more into her hands. I'm going to be straight with you. You are an incredible hero. You're strong, you're brave, and on most fronts you've got a DM and good head on your shoulders. At the rate you're going, you will be number one, and you'll do it by a long shot. No one can deny that, so I'm not going to try, but you'll be putting yourself in an early grave to do it. You will burn bright, and then you will die. I for one am not going to just sit and watch as you spiral. I've got to believe that someone, can knock some sense back into you, before it's too late. Blaze hesitated, something she ached to say but couldn't quite bring herself to put to words. Pushing out a strained breath through her teeth, she carefully placed the folder once more in front of him. You need to decompress, to remember there's something more than this career at the end of the day. Katsuki scoffed. Right? Like everyone he'd abandoned to be here? The family he'd practically cut off to put in more hours and garner more recognition? The friendships that he'd buried away to make sure that he didn't lose focus? He shut his eyes to block out the next thought, the biggest sacrifice, the flash of a face he knew would appear. No, he stated firmly, shaking his head in denial, I respect you a hell of a lot, but the only reason I came here was so that I could be the best. If you aren't going to let me do that, then there are hundreds of agencies who will gladly take your place. I wanted it to be you, and I'm going to be sad to go, but you knew going into this I didn't want anyone trying to hold my hand. I hope we'll be able to stay on good terms. You can send my last check to the apartment. Blaze's stare darkened with frustration, Katsuki clearly not open to receiving her help or advice if he was willing to burn the bridge between them so quickly. Likely he was hoping his threat to leave would convince her to back off, but Katsuki hadn't signed with her because she was a pushover. Leaning back in her chair, she gently shrugged, the open vulnerability and the fear neatly placed back behind her mask where they belonged. The fact she seemed so unconcerned about this departure put Katsuki on edge. However, the woman making no attempt to get in a last word or plea to change his mind. As if knowing something was waiting just beneath the surface, Katsuki didn't move from his place at her desk, his eyes slowly trickling to the folder that she still pressed in front of him. You're right, of course. You're in the top 20 rankings, you've got a good track record with villains and rescues, and you've never had a scandal. Any agency in the area would be eager to have you. They might even offer you more than we can. However, what those hundreds of agencies don't have is the rights to your contract. Katsuki's eyes flashed. Blaze had signed him into the agency for 1 year directly out of high school. She and America had proved to be such a good fit that he'd signed another 5-year contract after that, with the stipulation that the contract could be transferred to any of their sister companies around the world. Signing everything into writing had always been more about ensuring there was never any confusion about salary or the agency's obligations. Blaze had always known he intended to return to Japan, and she'd made sure his lawyer knew that too when overlooking her offer. He had heard of some managers using a contract to keep their rising stars from abandoning them the moment they became famous, but Blaze had never seemed interested in tying him down against his will. You can't force me to take a vacation, contract or not. If you try cutting my hours or missions, my lawyer will have you begging to get away with just giving me severance, Katsuki reminded, but Blaze seemed unfazed. Correct again. What I do have, however, is 12 more months of deciding with prejudiced discretion where you spend those hours. I control where you're allowed to patrol, what missions are sent to you, where you are or aren't allowed to use your quirk. The public trust my judgment on where the best use of your time is, and if you refuse to take my advice, to follow orders, then I'll use that power to have you sat at desk duty, filing away paperwork until you have no choice but to spend some of that time relaxing. Blaze reminded, and while Katsuki still wasn't sure there was no legal ground for him to fight this, he also knew Blaze wasn't stupid. And she didn't make empty threats. I'm not heartless, Bakugo. I know you don't want to lose any of the progress you've clawed and fought for, and I also know that forcing you to take a vacation, even with underhanded means, will do nothing for my cause if you're stubbornly fighting against me the entire time. Despite what this conversation has come to, all I want for you is to help, to make you the best. Blaze looked to him hopefully as his eyes finally focused on the folder. He was still sad, but Blaze had been right about one thing: he needed to start using his head. Either way, his rankings were going to take a hit. He could have his lawyer pore over the contract to try and find an out, but he doubted there was much he could actually force Blaze to do. Did he risk undoing everything he'd accomplished by calling her bluff, or did he play along and jump ship the minute he was out of contract? "What are you proposing?" he finally muttered. "A transfer, just until further notice. An old cohort of mine, the one who recommended you initially, needs some extra brawn at your old stomping grounds. It's an undercover mission, but since you're still signed with my agency, any points you earn for your time will still be counted in the American standings, civilian popularity excluded. Do what he asks, don't cause an international incident, convince him you're well-rested and socialized, and I'll let you do whatever you see fit," Blaze explained, looking at him hopefully. Katsuki furrowed his brows but took the folder regardless, flipping through the detailed profiles and mission summary. Undercover missions weren't exactly lucrative for the hero rankings, but they tended to have a higher payoff in mission points and good standing. He wasn't exactly the police's favorite go-to hero, so having a few missions purely done for their benefit wasn't a terrible career move. It wouldn't be shooting him up the charts, but if he did well, he could at least keep from falling any in his time away. "So if I want you to rip up my contract?" Katsuki clarified, raising a brow to her. "Once they send me word that you're cleared, then that's it. You're a free man. I want to avoid that, of course. I'd rather you back here, leading my team to victory, but I won't force you. Rake me over the coals for your new signing bonus, or go somewhere you feel can help you be better. It will be your choice. So, what will it be? One overseas mission, or a year of desk duty?" Blaze offered. Katsuki considered her words carefully, though it wasn't exactly like he had a choice. "Fine. Get it in writing and I'll pack my bags." Katsuki's nails bit into the worn handle of his luggage. He thought that after going through the laborious paperwork, the long night of packing, and the seemingly endless plane rides, he would be more mentally prepared to be back home. Staring at his childhood school, however, he found his legs locking, hesitation lingering through his form when he tried to step forward. A desperate part of him was tempted to just go back, to trade in his plane ticket and resign himself to a year of frustrating desk duty, peppered with middle fingers and colorful curses, until Blaze either relented or shipped him off to another agent. It was a stupid thought, especially after dedicating so much time to moving forward with the mission, but Katsuki would be lying if he wasn't halfway back to the taxi when a chaotically giddy cheer pierced through his eardrums. "Mr. Bakugo." "Hi. Hello. Oh gosh, it's so nice to finally meet you, Dash," the voice gasped, hurrying to come down and join him despite his previous attempt to escape. With a heavy sigh, Katsuki ran a frustrated hand down his face, momentarily closing his eyes to gather whatever patience was left in him as he turned back to face his greeter. "You must be U.A's coordinator?" he offered, trying to keep his voice from betraying exactly how much he didn't want to be here. He didn't give a DMN about hurting anyone's feelings, but considering that Blaze's requirement had entailed getting a sign-off from his mission handler, he didn't think it in his best interest to start off their interaction with his award-winning wit and personality. "I am. You can call me Aki," she chirped, seeming truly overwhelmed by simply being in his presence. It was something he might expect of a civilian, but considering the legends U.A dealt with on a daily basis, he had assumed that their employees would be more used to these types of meetings. When she had finally gathered herself enough to notice the luggage in his hands, she gave a quick clap, hurrying forward to ease him of the burden. "Oh, you packed so light," she joked, giving the suitcase a testing heft before extending her arm out beside her. Her arm, and his luggage, vanished into a linear blur of the environment. Katsuki raised a brow, watching as she pulled her arm out of the line, luggage nowhere in sight. Feeling his eyes upon her, she let out a nervous laugh, offering out her hands for him to examine. "Ah, that's my quirk. I call it displacement, though it's more showy than useful. It's like my own little personal storage locker that follows me anywhere I go," she laughed, motioning for him to follow as she hurried up the school's front steps. Her dismissal of her own quirk was strange to say the least, though he supposed that of the different teleportation quirks, one that only led to one limited location was likely to be a letdown. Overwhelmed by the familiar sights and scents of his training days, he couldn't stop himself from wondering what Deku would think of it, or how long she'd be trapped there, fielding his endless questions and curiosities. He shut down those thoughts quickly, not willing to dwell on the rest that would surely follow. He'd agreed to come to Japan, but the transfer had come so quickly he hadn't had time to sit and think about what that would mean. He was back home, sure, but he was here as punishment, a sadistic joke from his manager. It hadn't been on his terms, despite his promise to himself that it would. After failing so royally to balance his friendships and his work life, he had been determined to not let it be for nothing. Here he was, though, with nothing to show for all his time there, for all of the years he let slip by without thought. He wasn't here because he wanted to be, or because he was ready, and despite knowing that it was an objectively shitty thing to do, he couldn't bring himself to dial the phone and tell anyone that he'd made it home. He tried to rationalize the selfish longing. He had reason to stay quiet. The mission had been marked as an undercover operation after all. Even if he was allowed to tell everyone he was here, he was meant to be on protection duty, as ridiculous as that sounded. He'd likely be spending day and night with his mark, making sure to follow their schedule and keep them out of trouble. If all he could do was work, how was it any different from him being in America? Keeping his return a secret, not reaching out for any reunions, it was the only logical thing to do. No need to rattle everyone when he wouldn't even have time away to go and see them. "You're Udare alumni, right?" Aki suddenly called, her incessant meaningless chatter falling like white noise against his ears. At her expectant smile, though, he figured this time she expected him to respond. Unable to stop his annoyed sigh, he stuffed his hands in his pockets, flexing his fingers and knuckles to bite back his growing anger. "I mean, that's pretty obvious, right?" he asked. "That the whole point of why I was brought here is because they wanted someone who was a UDOTA graduate." "Oh, well, yes, of course, you are completely right," she stuttered, a sharp bite of embarrassment flooding her cheeks. "That have you been back to the school recently? We've had some very exciting changes in the past 3 years. Well, most of it has been rather internal, so I suppose it would be rather hard to notice unless you were one of the staff, but, oh, did you see the announcement that the school has opened up another department? It's been in the works behind the scenes for a few years, but this semester is the first students have officially been able to apply," she rambled, looking at Katsuki expectantly. Katsuki twisted his face at the proclamation, having to honestly take a moment to remember that EA even had more than just the Heroes department in its halls. He only ever bothered himself with thinking about them when he needed something from the batshit crazy engineers in support. Besides, it wasn't like he'd had much overlap with the general studies or management teams, especially not after the attacks had started up. It wasn't a fair criticism. Most of the final battle was only possible because of the students working behind the scenes. It just wasn't something he liked to think about, for better or worse. "What else is even left to cover?" he questioned, clearly igniting a waiting spark in her eye as she suddenly grabbed a tablet out of the air next to her. "Plenty, actually. As you know, UDOTA takes pride in being the best, not just in the teaching world, but in helping their students reach their full potential. All of our courses and curriculum has been rigorously tested and refined to ensure that each of the departments follow an agenda to most efficiently create well-rounded, experienced, and professional graduates." Aki turned to him with a beaming smile, clearly overjoyed to be able to brag about the school's accomplishments. After the Heroes War, however, it was brought to the school's attention that, despite its intentions, some students with exceeding potential could be left behind under our current schooling. Support heroes, for instance. Many that have abilities better suited off the battlefield have been weeded out thanks to our rigorous focus on combat and fitness. Moving them to general education also suppresses their true potential, as then their quirks are not being consistently refined and tested. In the past, we've done our best to adapt to each student, but those attempts in my experience have, well, fallen short, she admitted, gently shrugging as she flipped through a few pictures Katsuki didn't bother to look at. "That is where the new department comes in. Its working title is the SOS, Special Operations Students, although the principal tends to just refer to them as the problem children," she quietly laughed. Katsuki turned his head at that, finally taking the time to process what it was she was saying. His instincts screamed that it was unnecessary, likely more for optics than serving any actual purpose. There were plenty of sideline extras in his class, all of which had performed perfectly fine under the combat-heavy teachings. That program, paired with Aizawa's competence, was likely the only reason half of them were still alive today. You're telling me students actually signed up for that CRP? Who'd be stupid enough to risk their high school education to be some school guinea pig? Katsuki questioned with a raised brow. You'd be surprised actually. Aki quickly interjected, completely unfazed by his lackluster reaction. As we're still in a trial phase right now, the department is headed and run by only one teacher. When we opened up applications, however, over 25% of our currently enrolled students offered to diverge from their chosen department to his, she quickly explained. Katsuki managed to keep his mouth shut this time, but it didn't stop the low scowl from settling over his features. Okay, sure, that makes sense for the general education losers. All they had to do to get in was pass a written test. What about the hero department? You know, the kids who actually passed because of their talent? He questioned. At that, the director did have to tighten her smile, Katsuki touching a nerve he hadn't bothered to look for. After all, if she was this young working as an administrator at UE, it was doubtful she had passed the hero exam either. 35%, she happily answered, the highest of all the departments actually. Of course, most of those students ended up being turned down. When the creator set up the program, he wanted to make sure only children who may fail to flourish were redirected to the new curriculum. In the end, we settled on 7 lucky students. The program debuted about 6 months ago, and so far the school council has been extremely happy with the results. Reaching into thin air to grab her security card, she pressed it against a nearby alarm, opening up a pair of disguised elevator doors. Katsuki studied it carefully, not remembering this particular section of the school. In fairness, most of it had been remodeled after the war, its various changes in purpose and repeated destruction leaving it in need of a good refresh. The director motioned beside her for him to follow. Once Katsuki was inside, she tapped the lowermost button, the doors only pausing for a moment before shutting them both inside. What are we going down to the basement for? Katsuki questioned, shifting on his foot as the director swiped through a few bits on her tablet. Pulling another card out of thin air, she held it to the screen before handing it to Katsuki with a smile. Well, that's where you'll be working, silly, she informed. I must say, it's a streak of good luck to have been paired up with Mr. Yagi. He has been so active in making sure the students are safe and well taken care of. He's been instrumental in helping convince parents that UA is secure again. We wouldn't have even noticed that our student profiles were being hacked were it not for the program he helped install, the director continued, her eyes shifting into the same glossy reverence she'd held when meeting him at the entrance. Katsuki held back a sigh. Part of the undercover work for this mission was to provide protection without raising suspicion to the unidentified hackers, so it was incredibly unlikely that they'd partner him up with a teacher or faculty member he wasn't passably connected with. Even so, he'd been hoping for someone a little less chatty. All Might wasn't exactly the sort of person he trusted to keep his return to Japan a secret, even if he did somehow manage to convince him it was necessary. There was nothing he could do about it now, though. Making sure this mission went well would have to be his first priority. As long as he could get All Might to understand blabbering to his friends jeopardized the school, he'd have no choice but to go along with it. Whatever, I still don't get what I'm doing here. It's not like he exactly needs anyone protecting him, he muttered, flinching as her star-studded eyes immediately snapped to him in interest. Oh, are you and Mr. Yagi already familiar with one another? I knew you were a former student, of course, but I hadn't been told you've already met. Yeah, well, he's kinda hard to miss, isn't he? Katsuki asked, taking a step away as she let out a gentle laugh, cheeks burning with a girlish blush. Huh, well, you know I'm not normally the type to say, but I mean he is very handsome, isn't he? She confessed, completely unaware of the twinge of disgust written across his face. He felt a jolt of relief when the elevator doors opened, hurrying to put some space between them even as she turned to relock the doors. You still haven't explained what we're doing in the basement, he pointed out, taking in the bare hallway with a critical eye. Oh, of course. This is where Mr. Yagi is teaching, she answered, hurrying to lead him further down the narrow hallway. The basement wasn't decrepit by any means, But it still felt strange to be in such an abandoned part of the school. Most of the rooms they passed were storage, and though he was sure the director knew where she was taking him, he found it strange that a classroom was located so far away from the others. "I'm not a teacher, just so you know. If you expect me to go undercover as some TA, that isn't going to fly for long," Katsuki muttered. The director snorted at the idea before quickly hiding it behind a more polite and refined laugh. "Oh, don't worry about that. No one is expecting you to be. You're a rising hero after all. It would be rather foolish of us to try and pretend you're someone you're not. No, your notoriety won't be a problem. As I said, our main objective right now is simply keeping our teachers and students protected. We've already explained to the students that classrooms and outer activities will be receiving extra security. They may not know the exact details, but they know you're here to help," Aki confirmed. "As far as your mission parameters, you'll accompany the class during the day and retire to Mr. Yagi's residence at night. While you will not be on the clock per se, we do ask that you use risk assessment when planning your off time. Villains don't tend to stick to a convenient schedule, and you'll need to make sure you're able to protect your assigned agent, regardless of the hour of day," she prattled, repeating what Katsuki already knew. Yeah, I got it. I've done protection work before," Katsuki reminded, earning an altogether too bright smile for his liking. "Great. I suppose all that's left is to make introductions then." The woman came to a stop at the first designated classroom in the basement. The sign was clearly new, labeled B, although there was no BB or continuation. If he had to surmise a guess, it was because the school was planning on expanding the classrooms alongside the program, although at the moment it just looked comical. A pretend classroom for a pretend specialty, a handful of children playing at being special in their special program. For the life of him, he couldn't figure out what All Might was thinking. With his body as broken down as it wasn't too surprising he couldn't keep up with the hero courses any longer, but why this? With a rap of her finger against the door, the director gave a polite word of warning before walking inside. Katsuki followed behind, though he made no effort to hide the irritation from his face. Like she'd said, he wasn't here to teach. As long as he didn't actively bully these kids or their stupid choice in academic path, then he wasn't stepping out of bounds. If they wanted him to act happy to be here, they were going to have to pay him a lot more than what he signed on for. "Mr. Yagi?" Aki called, face twisting in perplexion at the teacherless classroom. "Oh, how strange, it seems he's not here yet." The director reached into her storage for a phone that looked distinctly different than any he'd seen on the market. By the branding and heft, it must have been something specific to you. The minimalist screen, likely an encrypted way for the staff to keep in contact. He didn't remember those being around when he was a student, but she had said they'd recently made changes to security. It seems he hasn't activated any sort of emergency protocol. He's probably just late then. I assure you this is very out of character. However, Mr. Yagi takes his job very seriously. You won't find a more dedicated teacher. Though, oh, of course you know that. Aki laughed, giving no more thought to the matter as she led him to the front of the class. The entire thing just felt pitiful. It was clear that the basement had been refitted for the new course's needs, but it was small and felt more like a club room than an actual classroom. The director had already mentioned that there were only 7 students, but seeing it in person was another matter. It was hard to believe so many Hero Corps students were vying for a spot in it. Graduating as a hero from UDA carried a great deal of weight and prestige, not to mention the many connections working as an intern could provide them. Even the entrance exam was targeted to only accept the best. Why anyone good enough to get in would bother abandoning it for something experimental was completely beyond him. Students, this is Pro Hero Dynamite, but for the remainder of his time here you may refer to him as Mr. Bakugo. He's a past UDA graduate and has come all the way from America to take part in the school's new buddy system. As such, he will be attending all specialty classes and training sessions with you from now on. Since Mr. Yagi is not here yet, I suppose I'll begin the introductions. Aki mused, happily shifting her gaze to a girl in the front row. Why don't we start with you, Ms. Aizawa? The girl sat to attention as Katsuki's eyes shifted to her. Though, with a twinge of surprise, he realized that they already knew each other. The name had been a giveaway, of course, but she wasn't exactly someone he could quickly forget either. Aizawa's daughter Eri, and he had never been close, at least, not as close as she was with Izuku, but he had been sure to keep an eye on her up to graduation. He was honestly shocked how much someone could grow over 5 years, barely recognizing the full-fledged teenager sitting in front of him. She still didn't look like an adult, far from it, but her round face held none of the ratio that had marked her as a child. As she stood up for her introduction, Katsuki realized she'd grown tall, taller than most girls her age at least. Her horn was no longer a bump hidden behind a lock of hair, instead protruding from the natural slope of her head before curling in on itself like a ram's. Her long white hair had been cut short into a bob, the blunt edges ending just below her chin. The biggest change, however, was the fact she had lost her air of uncertainty, no longer a child simply trying to hide away and survive. Her large red eyes met him with confidence, an assurance that she was entitled to be where she wanted to be, to say what she wanted to say. There was no burden or grief upon her shoulders, and it was clear that smiles came easily to her these days. He could only imagine this change had come from the many pep talks and affirmations given by her fathers, though he was sure Izuku and Mirio had something to do with that as well. Still, her shy nature was not so easily quelled, an embarrassed blush already spreading on her cheeks as she gave an overly formal bow to him from the side of her desk. "My name is Eri Aizawa. Though you probably knew that. It's very nice to see you again, Mr. Bakugo. Please take care of me and the rest of Eri chirped, keeping her voice low even as the boy next to her gave her arm a quick tug. "Eri, that idiot's only like 7 years older than us, you don't need to bow to somebody like him, the young boy murmured. Katsuki narrowed his eyes, this kid's face familiar too, though he couldn't place why. The boy's pinprick black eyes suddenly glared at him under the attention, as if staring him down might make him give up and call the matter a lost cause. The director cleared her throat in warning, causing the boy to groan and roll his eyes in response. Even then he refused to get up from his seat until Eri gave him an expectant stare. He was a good few inches shorter than Eri, his face rough and square, much the same way Katsuki's was at that age. His body was lean with strong shoulders and well-worked arms, his hair wild with jet black spikes, styled just enough to make the chaos seem purposeful. "My name's Kota Izumi, we've met before. Honestly, you should remember, but you're probably too stupid to think back that far," he began. Eri narrowed her eyes and he quickly readjusted. "That what I mean is, it's been a while, hero. Good to see you again, I guess." This pleased Eri well enough, her anger immediately melting to praise as she shot him a not-so-subtle thumbs-up beneath the table. Katsuki was too lost in his own attempt at recollection to notice, only putting the two together as he saw the kid's idiotic red sneakers. That's right, another one of Izuku's many strays. He'd stuck to the nerd like glue during the war, practically spearheading the effort to convince the refugees of Izuku's necessity. He wasn't exactly what anyone would call a charmer, but it was hard for adults not to listen when a child starts berating them on morality. Judging by the well-worn red sneakers, the boy's adoration for Izuku had not yet dissipated, though knowing Izuku, it was unlikely that the two had ever lost touch. He knew more than most what living through a war could do to a child, and Kota had lost more than most. Memories Katsuki had long ago buried suddenly found themselves creeping to the surface, the teenagers in front of him flickering to their childhood forms. He could hear their distant cries, their desperation as the adults tried to bar Izuku from their walls. Katsuki didn't want to think what might have happened should they not have been able to convince them, should the public have rejected Izuku exactly as All for One intended. Even now the recollection of that fight, of the mess they'd let Izuku become, made his stomach twist uncomfortably. Thankfully he was driven from such thoughts when the last student in the front row rolled forward. Her chair was low to the ground with large wheels and a star-shaped cover over the metal. It was a custom build, meaning it was needed on a more permanent basis. With practiced ease she opened the top of her desk to scoot to the wide gap at its side, specifically placed so that she could more easily maneuver. She wore one of the school's long skirts, the folds of the fabric falling limp somewhere around where he suspected to be her knees. Tucked away on the back of her chair were two abstract prosthetics, the strange structure of metal more normally seen on the track or Olympics than day-to-day wear. She had impossibly deep black coils, her curls painted with white streaks breaking from her scalp at random. The white extended to the hair on her face, her lashes and brows stark against her dark complexion. "Good morning, it's very nice to meet you," the girl began, her formal greeting delivered in perfect English. Katsuki blinked, feeling his mind physically shift at the sudden change, having to rework her words after slipping back into his native language. All in all, he was actually fairly fluent in English, but something about being home, being here, had him falling back into old habits. The girl waited until she was sure he understood before beginning again. "My name is Cassandra Sato. My friends still in America talk about you often. They're going to be very surprised to hear you're assigned to our classroom. I hope that we can work well together from this point forward," Cassandra finished, making her way back to her desk as the next student suddenly shot up from the row behind her. This kid was easily the tallest of them all, standing near a foot taller than even Katsuki, their arms and legs lacking much tone or muscle. He was so lanky Katsuki theorized a strong wind could probably topple them over, though Katsuki had learned long ago not to attribute power to someone's physical appearance. His long, dark purple hair was pulled into a low ponytail, a simple white ribbon keeping it secure at the base of his neck. His eyes matched his hair's color, his gaze serious and respectful as he too offered Katsuki a low bow. "Thank you for taking care of us. I, Yoshi Watanabe, will be in your care," the student introduced, his words and tone already too overly formal for Katsuki's taste. The student beside him made no such efforts, their eyes bored as they scrolled through a barely hidden phone in their pocket. Yeah, cool it Yoshi, you look like a dork," the boy muttered. Of all his classmates he certainly put a good deal of effort in how he presented himself, his hair a marbled swirl of pastel pink and blue cut in a sharp fade, intricate mythic runes shaved to the scalp along the edges of his hairline, the bold choices a rather confusing medley of feminine and masculine energy. His eyes kept the same pattern, one pink and one blue, likely meaning the hair was natural. Whatever the case, Katsuki did not interest him in the slightest, his body making no effort to move as he waved a lazy hand in greeting. "Ren Fujiata, whatever, it's not like you're going to be around long anyways," he muttered. The director sighed, barely having time to discipline him before the next student jumped up to greet him. "I guess that means it's my turn. Cool beans. I've read a lot about you. I mean the hero you. I don't know where you live or anything like that, although I guess I do know your parents' names." "Oh, that's because they're famous too though. Your mom just put out this super cool collection based on bugs and my mom has always said my hybrid quirk is based off of Luna moths so, oh. I'm Suki Ikeda by the way." Katsuki shook his head in an effort to listen, her high-pitched rambling practically turning to gibberish the longer he was forced to listen. Suki was the only hybrid hero in the room, her eyes filled with black, an almost glowing green replacing where her pupils should be. While at first glance he had thought she was simply pale, he could see now that it actually held a soft lime undertone. Her hair, or maybe her wings, fell around her waist, painted with spots and patterns. As her excitement grew, the antenna on top of her head twitched, the two bottom wings of her hair also fluttering in anticipation. "Oh, and this is an Yamada Dash," Suki informed, quickly moving out of the way so that she could motion to the girl behind her. The last student was noticeably hiding herself in the corner, placed in the very back of the classroom's shadows despite the many open seats that sat in front of her. At being singled out, Anne's unnaturally large eyes stared at him in shock before looking away, frigid with fright. For someone so clearly wishing to blend in, she did herself no favors, wearing a masterfully meticulous face of Lolita makeup and frilly underclothes. Vintage undergarments covered what skin the school uniform didn't reach, and under the director's eager eyes, she clung to an old porcelain doll, hiding her face behind it. In the new position, Katsuki could make out cracks of silver going up the girl's hand from her wrist, like her body had literally been shattered and melted back together. "She's pretty shy, so don't take it personally if she just straight up ignores you the next couple days." Suki laughed, giving the girl a few hearty pats on the shoulder, and merely whimpered, sinking further into her self-made safety, though it seemed Suki knew better than to push it any further. "Well, that's everyone then, I suppose," Aki mused, glancing once more to the watch along her arm. "So strange. Poor Mr. Yagi must have gotten caught up somehow. Regardless, I'm sure he would have called if he were not already close by, she reasoned. Handing Katsuki a tablet of his own, she moved to exit through the classroom door. I'm afraid I do have some things I need to tend to, but please, be sure to see me if you have any questions. If Mr. Yagi does end up needing a substitute, I'll come and collect you. Students, please make sure you do not interrupt Mr. Bakugo more than necessary. He is here to help Mr. Yagi, not assist with the program. Be kind and let Mr. Bakugo do what he needs to make sure he can fulfill his own assignment. I trust that you will all be on your best behavior, she warned, making eyes at a few of the troublemakers. Wait, so you're just going to leave me here? Katsuki questioned. They're just high school students, Mr. Bakugo. I have confidence you've faced worse in your time as a hero. Besides, I'm sure Mr. Yagi will be in soon. Until then you can catch up on the necessary paperwork for your transfer, Aki happily suggested. The thought of more bureaucratic nonsense, the only thing potentially worse than keeping 7 teenagers occupied. Katsuki groaned, not attempting to hide his frustration before kicking one of the students' chairs to an unoccupied corner. All of them turned to him expectantly, but when he awarded their attention with a snarl, they made quick work to occupy themselves. Eri was the first to move. She grabbed a few papers off the teacher's desk before handing them out. Without needing to be told, the kids all unpacked their supplies and started fill the worksheets in. Katsuki, who had been pointedly ignoring the student's existence, found his eyes shifting to the student in the back of the class as the doll she had been holding with such embarrassment now moved of its own free will along her desk. He tilted his head, looking for hidden strings or mechanisms, the doll bending down to grab a paper from Anne's hand before hopping with delicate jumps to the next student. The practice was clearly a normal occurrence as no one gave any sort of reaction. Suki handed the doll her own paper before making a bridge from her arms to help it jump to the next row. Once she was finished collecting all of the papers, she plopped herself on the teacher's chair, her form so small that it looked as if the chair was simply spinning of its own volition. The students all glanced to each other in question as to what to do next, but thankfully neither party had to wait much longer, the door practically flying off its rails as their teacher stumbled inside. Mr. Yagi! You're late, young man. Suki called from her seat, the rest of the class quick to turn to attention as the man tripped over his own feet in an attempt to get to his desk. I am so sorry, everyone, he called, rushing to set everything he was holding down on the desk. There was a huge villain fight on 2nd St this morning and they were detouring traffic all the way up to 24th. I thought I was going to have to learn light speed just to get myself here at all, but thankfully once I broke the capture zone it thinned out pretty fast. I still had to speed a little on the last leg, but only a little. Not that you should speed at any time. It's illegal for a reason, he rambled, shuffling to rid himself of the coat on his shoulders. So you broke the law to speed near a cop zone in an effort to get here on time, but you still managed to get yourself a coffee? Run questioned, raising a brow. Huh, he looked to the coffee in his hand, practically squealing in embarrassment as he hurried it onto the desk. Well, you're right. I did get coffee. But it was before the detour. It was a get up early so I can be on time, coffee, not a I'm already late so I might as well, coffee. He let out a hurried breath as he tossed his coat across his seat. The small doll made panicked circles on the chair before crawling out from beneath it, scurrying to climb the drawers to return to the table's edge. Well, of course you're right that it doesn't exactly hurt my performance review to be 5 minutes late versus 10, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that I would make a detour when I'm already late, the teacher continued to ramble, but it matters to me that I don't keep you all waiting. I'm sure I have the receipt somewhere. It has the date and the time on it, so if you add it into a GPS you'll see that I dash. I think Ren was just trying to rile you up, Mr. Yagi. We all know you're very careful about being punctual, Eri comforted, offering the man a reassuring smile. All right, thank you, Eri. Well, no sense wasting any more time, huh? Morning worksheets. Now where did I put those morning worksheets? He answered, fumbling to fit his glasses back in place. Eri already handed them out. Lolly's been trying to give them to you, Koda informed, motioning with his hand to the doll who was impatiently tapping her foot in tantrum. Oh, thank you, Lolly, he laughed, bowing his head in thanks and apology, before taking the papers and setting them to the side. With a hurried step he turned to the board, coffee still in hand as the other hurried across it with chalk. I suppose we can just jump straight into quirk analysis then if your brains are already limber. To keep on the topical, and because I had way too much time to think about it on the drive over, let's talk about the attack the heroes contained this morning and see how it applies to what we've learned already. Actually, Mr. Yagi, we have a guest. He's been waiting for you to arrive. Eri interrupted, barely able to get out the statement before their teacher turned on his heel. A guest? He questioned, voice tinged with worry before cutting off completely, halted, like the breath had been stolen from his lungs. Katsuki's breath shuddered, a pounding pain slamming between his ribs as wide viridian eyes were glued onto his own. His entire world had stopped, his mind, unwilling to accept the reality of this world, despite the fact that no matter what he tried he could not wake himself up. Kaken? Izuku breathed and it took everything in Katsuki to not shatter. The coffee fell from Izuku's limp fingertips, barely saved by the doll as it slapped its porcelain arms around the cup. Katsuki could hear his blood pounding in his ears, something so violently loud growing in his chest that he wasn't sure whether he wanted to scream or cry. He had known before he'd even opened the door, he hadn't believed his own senses, but he knew by the demon sound of his steps, the barely heard mutters of panic before he'd even come into view. Looking at him now, face to face, hearing that name dripping from his lips, Katsuki could no longer find any semblance of forethought. He felt his brows knit and his eyes darken, clouded by a fury he could not rush to stop, surprised to find, when he chose to look, the expression mirrored on Izuku's face. Deku, he growled. Katsuki, Izuku curtly replied. Just what the hell was going on? Chapter 3. The View from Rock Bottom. What the hell is going on, Deku? Katsuki hissed, barely able to keep the seething fury out of his voice. He knew logically that it likely wasn't warranted, knew that anger was just the thing he always seemed to fall back on when he was confused or caught off guard. But the truth was seeing Izuku, seeing him here, was worse than the fear of an ambush, worse than any sort of ploy a villain had ever tried to pull, and it immediately sent his fight or flight into gear. He'd be stupid to not have expected some sort of reunion. It was the first time he'd been to Japan in years, and even if he managed to keep it from all of the extras, his parents would happily blab to Inko the first chance they got. He knew that, was figuring out how to deal with that, but he'd never intended anyone to know the full details of his transfer, especially not Deku. Being here though meant Izuku was part of the mission. It meant he was no doubt aware that he had been placed on probation, that all of his years away and accomplishments had spiraled down to this, to nothing. He equally wanted to rush to save face and threaten his life for showing up at all. Shame, guilt and embarrassment all fought for control, the flurry settling in his stomach, agony, hatred. But he pushed all of that away, fanning the flames of the familiar and gripping his rage like a lifeline. Anger kept him moving, anger kept him alive. Are you just gonna stand there like an idiot? What kind of stunt are you trying to pull? Katsuki demanded, his gaze subconsciously flickering across Izuku's form. Izuku looked different. His normally short hair had grown messy and long, the hair tie holding back the handful of curled locks practically half undone from his morning rush. His muscular body was swallowed up by a gray blazer, the jacket a rather nice design had he not ruined it with the Uravity graphic shirt underneath. Despite never needing glasses, his eyes were covered by a pair of thin silver frames, presumably to match the chunky metal bracelet and ring peeking from beneath the cuff of his jacket. Before he had a chance to see if he was still wearing his lame red sneakers, Izuku's hard stare narrowed, angry and unflinching under Katsuki's bite. It was unnerving to say the least, the muted seething not something he was used to seeing on his face. What was even stranger was the coldness, the warmth that had been present only moments ago now vacant and frigid. And, though it might have been the jet lag talking, he was almost certain that he was exuding some sort of dark cloud, the air around him tasting like tangible death. Whoa, a black Oraha? That's a new one, Koda noted with interest. Eri's eyes widened, quickly turning in her seat to panically shake Suki's arm. Suki, your quirk? She quietly stressed. Suki jumped to attention, her antenna shooting into a rigid line as she realized what she was doing. The black mist lingering around Izuku vanished, but his hard stare did not. "Sorry. I'm so sorry, I didn't even realize I was doing it," she breathed, her wings instinctively twitching in shaken shock. With far too much control for Katsuki's liking, Izuku placed the chalk back down onto his desk before motioning calmly to the door. "May I speak with you outside for a moment, Mr. Bakugo?" he questioned, causing an unpleasant shiver to run up Katsuki's spine. His organs moved sideways in his body, physically sickened by the sound coming out of Izuku's mouth. Even if the man was undercover, even if they had been apart with no contact for 5 years, something felt viscerally wrong about Izuku calling him anything but his childhood nickname. "Gladly," he growled, desperately trying to corral his unease, practically flipping the desk he was sitting in as he stormed through the door. Izuku kept his eyes trained on him, easily following behind as he calmly closed the door behind them. Before the latch had even caught, Katsuki was already fuming, his hands curled into tight fist as he grunted in frustration. "Izuku Midoriya, of course it was Izuku Midoriya. God, I should have known it was you that dragged me into this," he hissed, not bothering to lower his voice despite how much effort Izuku had made to give them privacy. "What sort of strings did you pull to get me here?" Izuku crossed his arms in agitation, clearly trying to stay his tongue. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Izuku hissed, though for now his voice remained steady. "Get you here for what?" "For the mission, dumbass. The one you're assigned here for," Katsuki shouted. Izuku raised a brow, genuine confusion etched across his features. For a moment Katsuki felt like he lost his footing, his rage dimming for a singular second before flying back to its peak. Izuku could put on whatever act he wanted. What other explanation could there be? Deku was the symbol of peace, the strongest and most capable hero of their generation. He ended the hero war, destroyed Shigaraki, and all for one, literally saved the world from total annihilation. The idea that he needed a hero to protect him, for Katsuki to protect him, was laughable at best and insulting at worst. As if reading Katsuki's mind, Izuku let out a heavy sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. "That I'm not on any mission, Bakugo. I had no idea the school was even outsourcing its security to pro heroes, let alone that you were contacted. Trust me, if I'd been informed beforehand I would have had some choice words of my own," he muttered, the easy slip of his name causing another roll of disgust to seep through his stomach, only further aggravating his skepticism. "Right," he taunted, unable to keep from rolling his eyes in turn. "It's obvious now why they forced me here. What the hell were you thinking, Deku? I didn't call you for a couple of months, and what, you put me down as some partner request? Is that it? Did you even think about what kind of influence you have? No wonder Blaze made up some CRP to force me here. No one's going to say no to the goddamn symbol of peace. Who cares what I think about it, right?" Katsuki snapped, his voice dripping with venom. "I'm sure this is a real treat for you then," he rambled, pointing an accusatory finger. "You get a wild hair, and instead of asking me how I feel about it, our agencies go over my head and derail my whole goddamn life." Izuku kept eerily quiet, keeping his hard cold eyes upon Katsuki as the man spiraled. His lack of reaction only further grew Katsuki's unease. He'd expected Izuku to try and shut him up somehow, especially considering how, in character, he had been holding until now. Even if the man didn't want to wallow and beg for forgiveness, he could at least try and fight back. Because he had to have a good reason for dragging him here, he had to have an explanation, right? And what the hell's up with that stupid undercover persona? Yagi? Really? Couldn't think of anything more original? Katsuki jabbed, already feeling himself running out of steam but unable to take the tense quiet any longer. His insult finally drew a response, Izuku's brow further tightening as he clenched his arms across his chest, the toned muscles beneath his shirt growing tighter. "Not much I can do about it, seeing as how that is my name," Izuku replied. Katsuki groaned, tipping his head back. The urge to ignite and burst flickered in his clasped fist, but he forced it to dim. It was bad enough to have been dragged into the sheet show. He couldn't put up with Izuku feigning ignorance too. His eyes moved to the classroom, knowing full well that the students inside could likely overhear if he continued yelling. It was possible Izuku was keeping up the act for their sake, but why he felt the need to Katsuki couldn't understand. The school's director had shown him all of the relevant files while leisurely walking through the school grounds, and it wasn't as if she tried to hide the reason he was there to the students. If Izuku was supposed to remain undercover even while on campus, wouldn't they have said something earlier? It seemed like a pretty rocky operation to just throw them together and see what happens, though perhaps Izuku had assured them that there was no need. They hadn't talked in 5 years, but Izuku had seen himself as his friend through worse. Bullshit, Katsuki angrily countered. You just don't want to get into this because you know it was a total D move. Well, I don't give a shit about what you want. Your little cult of underachievers can wait. We're doing this now. Katsuki pushed, trying to regain the upper hand. Despite his unflinching expression, Katsuki could tell Izuku's patience was growing thin, something only he ever seemed to actually achieve. Instead of giving in to his shouting match, however, Izuku stepped forward, his cold eyes daring Katsuki's own to look away. Even without the girl's quirks surrounding him, Katsuki could feel the difference in the air. His form tightened on instinct, his chest puffing as he subconsciously readied himself to stand his ground. Within his fist his quirk popped, eager and willing. How many times can I rephrase that I have no idea what you're talking about? You're not stupid, Bakugo, so stop acting like it. If I was attached to this mission in any way, why would I have an undercover persona and not you? Beyond that, if I had been the one to ask for you, don't you think we'd have some sort of debriefing before you were just thrown into my classroom? The classroom I'm supposedly undercover in? Or do you actually think everyone around you is so dense they couldn't see an argument like this coming from a mile away? Izuku questioned. It's not exactly like we have a reputation of being cool and collected, at least not around each other, he added with a mutter. Katsuki scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. Your classroom? What a stupid role to try and put you in, he muttered. That director lady clearly had no qualms giving me confidential information in the school, so just drop the act and be straight with me. Why are they having you be the one who does this? They trying to bait out whoever's been screwing with the security system. Izuku kept his eyes on Katsuki, not bothering to try and answer. After a moment he shook his head in defeat and slid open the door so that his voice would carry into the classroom. Eri, please supervise the others until an aide arrives. Mr. Bakugo and I need to have a chat with the principal, Izuku stated, waiting only until he heard a quiet reply to turn towards the lone elevator at the end of the hall. Katsuki raised a brow, the man not even bothering to wait and see if he'd follow. Stifling another growl, he shuffled into the cramped space, all the more aware of its size now that he was sharing it with Izuku. He couldn't help but fidget as they waited, his foot tapping without conscious thought as he watched the floors increase. He had convinced himself that once the doors shut and they were free of prying ears, Izuku would break down into what was really going on, preferably with stuttering apologies and adequate levels of groveling. Instead, he remained tensely quiet, no longer bothering to spare Katsuki a glance even as he guided them through the school. The long silence was uncomfortable and strange, but Katsuki would be demed if he was the first to break it. Instead, he shoved his hands into his pockets, whittling away at his raging thoughts until they were daggers, mentally preparing himself for whatever nonsense the two of them might try to throw his way. Just as he put the finishing touches on a new derogatory nickname for the overbearing mouse, he found himself once again floundering, completely caught off guard when it was Aizawa staring back at him. Izuku Bakugo, he called in a tired greeting. Ugh, don't call me Bakugo if you're not going to call him Midoriya, it sounds weird, Katsuki hissed, immediately throwing himself into the nearest chair. Aizawa raised a contemplative brow at the man's tantrum but otherwise remained unfazed. His old teacher had been aging well given the hell they'd put him through. His hair was longer and he'd put on enough weight to not be so fragile. As far as he'd last heard, the man was supposed to be training Deku before returning to his teaching job. He had no idea when he decided to take such a big promotion, or why. The whole thing stank and Katsuki couldn't help but feel he was being given the runaround. Aizawa waited for either one of them to start, but when all he got were stares he sighed and shrugged, pushing aside the stack of paperwork he was currently reading through. All right, Katsuki, he tried instead, though it still sounded offensive to Katsuki's ears, to what do I owe the pleasure? I was told by Aki that Katsuki, had already been briefed. Was she misinformed? Someone was. Izuku stressed, quickly placing his hands down on the man's desk. How long exactly has this been in the works? And why the hell wasn't I told? Weeks ago when all of this started, Aizawa answered, his face holding a tint of confusion despite the evenness of his tone. Katsuki was a late arrival to the mission. I only got word that he had signed on last night. I was going to go over the finer details with you this morning, but the staff couldn't find you before classes started. I figured, seeing as how it was Katsuki, I could just give you the paperwork later. After all, you knew that all of the teachers would be receiving security detail until this data breach is settled. Finding a partner for you has merely been a more timely task. You knew this was coming, so I'm unsure why you're so angry. Izuku bit back an eager remark, his eyes flicking away from Aizawa's own. It was clear that the motion did not go by unnoticed, Aizawa taking in Katsuki with more clarity, as if trying to piece together what Izuku was not offering by reading Katsuki instead. Before he had a chance to make any conclusions, however, Izuku stepped forward, attempting to take back what little control the situation offered. My house is more than well enough equipped to handle any sort of attack, and this school is one of the safest places in Japan. Katsuki has made it quite clear he didn't volunteer for the job, and placing a pro-hero here with me to babysit is quite honestly bordering on asinine. So, thank you, but all of this is really not needed and I'd like to go back to teaching my class now, unescorted, Izuku answered. Katsuki watched Izuku tense in agitation as a long, familiar sigh fell from Aizawa's lips. All those petitions and demands for security upgrades and protocols, and the moment we actually have a legitimate, provable concern, you want to turn a blind eye? Aizawa questioned, intertwining his fingers together to lean his head atop. Izuku's foot twitched, the both of them staring at one another in a pass of silent language that each had clearly spent years learning. My security concerns were for the students, not my own. My identity has already been compromised. If I am ever in danger, it's not going to be because of what they gained from those employee records, Izuku eagerly replied, though it was clear the excuse wasn't doing him any favors. That may be, but I can't protect you from the unknown, Izuku. What I can do is take sensible action when a threat has been presented, Aizawa reminded with a low glance. Katsuki watched them with careful eyes, feeling like an outsider despite being in the room. He knew that the two had grown close from those years in private training, but the connection he was seeing now was far beyond simple student and mentor. It was like they were old friends, bickering over a long-running feud. Thanks to our increased vigilance, the attackers were only able to access some of the data, yes, but we are still unsure of what they were even trying to steal in the first place. There are many parts of our system that have yet to receive a full upgrade, and what we do know is that the teachers' profiles, including addresses and civilian names, may have been at risk. Until we learn who did this and why, I'm not taking any chances with any of you, regardless of power or age or preference, he commanded, and though his words were final, there was a hint of softness in his eyes that felt out of place between them, each staring at one another in quiet warning, something understood but not said. That of course none of that means that your SCRT has to be dynamite, he added lazily, causing Katsuki's heart to suddenly clench. My concern for your safety does not override your right to feel safe and comfortable with whoever is assigned to you. With that being said, the heroes I have left don't have the same impressive track record at keeping you alive. If you choose to ask for someone else, with you living so far out of the city, I'd really feel best having 2 or 3 heroes on shift at a time. As for Dynamite, well, I'm sure whatever displeasure at the situation he's announced is misplaced. From what I understand, it is incredibly important to his career that this mission goes well. As the professional that I know him to be, it would be incredibly unwise of him to make his mark feel uncomfortable before his detail has even started. Katsuki tightened but bit back an argument. After all, just what could he say to counteract that? He'd been caught off guard seeing Izuku there, finding it so easy to believe that he had been the reason Blaze had turned on him, that it wasn't ever actually Katsuki's fault. Only, as impossible as it felt, Izuku seemed truly confused by his presence, and if it hadn't been him that drafted him here, then that meant Blaze's contract and threats still stood. Thankfully Izuku knew better than to ask what Aizawa had meant, his gaze merely flicking to Katsuki's form in an effort to sift out the sincerity. Well? Aizawa questioned, always seeming to know just when his students had reached a conclusion. Izuku let out a small sigh, defeat riddling through his shoulders. Fine. He breathed, quietly pushing off of the man's desk. Just flew in, right? Just take your bags and decompress at the house. You can set up whatever sort of perimeter you want while I finish out the school day. Katsuki got the feeling Izuku was less concerned about having security set up than he was about putting distance between them, but he didn't need to be told twice. Pushing away his chair, he moved to storm out of the office when Izuku grabbed hold of his wrist, sending an unnatural jolt of electricity through him, the shared contact so hot that for the first time in his life Katsuki feared he might actually burn. His eyes shot to it, expecting to see some trace of Izuku's quirk, but all there was skin. You're going to need these, Izuku muttered, handing off a keycard and a cell phone. Katsuki raised a brow, able to logic what the card might be for, though the phone threw him for a loop. It was off-brand, but had a custom case and buttons, so it was unlikely to be a burner. Before he could complain that he had his own supplies provided from the agency, Izuku rolled his eyes, pushing the items forward. You'll need my phone to remotely disable the security. Unlocking the door won't be enough, he muttered. Katsuki nodded, caught off guard by Izuku's ability to read his thoughts before he'd actually voiced them. Now that Aizawa had all but proven that Izuku had nothing to do with his assignment here, the guilt and shame had already slowly started to seep back in. He knew that his temper was nothing new. He'd yelled at Izuku before, had accused him of worse. The man could handle a little misplaced anger, but this wasn't exactly how he'd wanted this reunion to go. Not that he had any idea, just what he'd hoped had been different. All right. Well, if that's all, then I suggest you return to your students, Izuku. I think it's best we not let their imaginations get the better of them, left to their own devices as they are, Aizawa announced, pulling Izuku's eyes off Katsuki. After a moment he nodded, unwilling to start another fight that he knew he'd lose. Katsuki would be assigned to him, that was all there was to it. The faster he found a way to get over it and return to his normal, the better. As Izuku turned to leave, Katsuki went to follow, his movement given pause as Aizawa's trained stare suddenly pierced down his own. Not you, Katsuki, not yet, he urged. Katsuki sighed, defeat falling through his shoulders as he slumped back into the chair. He should have known that Aizawa wouldn't just let things lie, not with how upset Izuku had been from their pairing. With how casually Aizawa brought up his joining the program, he wouldn't be surprised if the man had no idea they'd even fallen out of contact. After all, with everything they went through, with all the hell they'd pushed past, what possible force could be strong enough to tear them apart? Always me. Would you mind explaining exactly what happened there? Aizawa questioned. Katsuki let out a tired breath as he pushed his hair off his face. I might have jumped the gun and accused him of being the reason I ended up here, he muttered, hoping if he was quiet enough Aizawa might mishear or give up on prying. Unfortunately, he was given no such luck. The reason you ended up here? Aizawa repeated, the familiar tinge of disappointment not lost on him. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand that was a situation all of your own making. Even if your agency wanted to give you no choice but to accept this mission, I highly doubt they would cite poor job behavior as an incentive to send you. I had thought Blaze's report on your performance was strange, given the Katsuki I know, but perhaps I was wrong. Are you really already falling back into old habits of blaming Izuku for your own personal failures? After everything you worked through to change that? Katsuki's lungs tightened, feeling small and cornered. All at once he was 14 years old again, targeted by villains because no one could believe he'd turn into a hero. I was just I was caught off guard, okay? I was said he was working the same mission without telling me, like he knew I wouldn't accept if I knew we would be working together. I thought he was just being normal Deku and trying to manipulate me into talking to him. I just didn't like that I was being tricked. Katsuki shouted, feeling out of breath despite the fact that his body was motionless. Aizawa's expression softened, but Katsuki had a sickening feeling it was not because of his explanation. He almost wished the man would go back to being angry. Anything was better than being pitted. Because he is working the same mission, isn't he? I mean, come on, he's not really. Katsuki tested, but Aizawa stayed silent. A great deal has changed while you've been gone, Katsuki. I wasn't lying when I said I think you are the best person for this job, and that I trust you implicitly, but I need your assurance that the man I'm giving this mission to is not the same child that I once knew. I can't knowingly put Izuku back in that person's care. I won't. Aizawa warned. The judgment in his eyes had softened, but he looked no less stern. It was clear, whatever was happening, whatever Izuku had gotten himself into, one wrong move and there would be no second chances. He'd heard it before. From Aizawa, from All Might, from Blaze. This time though it hit him like a punch, something that felt tangible and raw as it ripped from his heart to his throat. This was wrong. All of this was wrong. He had worked so hard, proven himself time and time again. He'd done everything they'd asked, been better than everyone else, so why? Why didn't Blaze believe in him? Why didn't Aizawa? Why were they treating him like some weakling? Like a kid? Why would you say that? Katsuki breathed, sounding far more hurt than he had been willing to let on. Look, things are weird between us right now, but that doesn't mean I'm not gonna protect the sheet out of that nerd. Though, I think you and I both know he's right, Deku doesn't need protecting dash. That's not what I'm concerned about, Katsuki. You're a pro hero and a good one. I'm not worried about you failing against an unknown villain. After all, I think we both know the only person who can really hurt Izuku is standing right in front of me, Aizawa corrected, giving Katsuki pause. He didn't like the implication, but it wasn't like he was wrong, no matter how much he wanted to dismiss it. With a heavy breath, Katsuki shook his head, trying to gather himself. I'm not that person anymore. You know I'm not. Deku and I have shit to work out, but I'm not gonna let anyone hurt him. Me included, Katsuki answered, firmly, leaving no room for question. He screwed up, he knew that, and he'd probably continue to screw up, but that didn't mean he was him again. He wasn't sure if Aizawa believed him given the man's silence, but eventually he gave a resigned sigh and nodded, handing back the mission tablet. I certainly hope so. Regardless, I must caution you to refrain from any further outburst. Is that understood? He pressed. Yeah, I got it, Katsuki muttered, feeling that same bit of shame riding higher in his gut. Aizawa hadn't talked down to him like that since he was a freshman, and though it should have only furthered his anger, he couldn't help but feel that he had done something far more wrong than he'd meant to. Not that he'd meant to yell at Izuku in the first place, a fact that was quickly growing more difficult to come to terms with the longer he had to cool down. Why was he like this? He wasn't even angry at Izuku until he realized he had no leg to stand on, that they wouldn't both be apologizing or standing on equal footing. He hadn't been angry until seeing his face, shocked and hurt, and realizing that he was in the wrong. His mind had been so quick to find some reason that he wasn't the only villain, that he wasn't the only one who had made a mistake, that he'd ended up making an awful situation even worse. Whatever the cause, he was too high-strung to try navigating all of this, the shift from risking his life on patrol to mending emotionally broken relationships too great. He felt like his whole body was experiencing whiplash, dragged from one burning dumpster fire to another. Was this what Blaze had wanted? For him to come home and make an absolute butt of himself within the first 5 minutes? Or was she hoping he'd come to that realization himself, trapped in a vicious cycle of violence and self-loathing? Maybe Aizawa was right, maybe he really had just fallen back into old habits. With a heavy groan, Katsuki gathered his supplies and returned to the front of the school. By the time he reached the front doors, someone already had a car waiting, his luggage tucked neatly within the back seat. He raised a brow at the lack of driver, giving his mission items another once-over. There were no keys, and no one had mentioned borrowing one from the school. He stepped closer to see if the keys were hidden somewhere close, only to jump backward as the car revved to life, the phone in his hand vibrating with a small chirp before jumping to the car dash. Before he had a chance to get a good look at the interface, the console guided itself to navigation, a second later loading up an address he didn't recognize. Any attempt to change the address or change applications was blocked, but given the context clues, he had to assume the car knew more of what was going on than he did. With an abundance of caution, he lowered himself into the driver's seat. Despite the new features, thankfully, the rest of the car was still manually driven. While he was still on private property, he gave the car a quick test, going above the speed limit, diverting from the map's instructions, and laying hard on the brake. The car took away no control other than to give a word of protest from the console, reminding him to drive safely and correct his destination. For the first time in hours, Katsuki felt himself relax. It was a small victory, but it was the most amount of control he'd gotten since he'd landed here. As much as he would have preferred to avoid the tongue lashing he'd just received, he was slightly relieved to be given some time alone before his mission actually started, especially as the person he would be stuck here with, and supposedly protecting, was none other than the one person in the world he had been unprepared to face. Izuku's cold and angry eyes flickered in his vision, and all at once the reality of what he'd seen, what he'd done began to burrow in. It had been easy to pass off Izuku's strange new garb and occupation as the work of an undercover identity. It was what had fueled his conspiracy about his placement in the first place, the difference between the pro-hero he left and the man standing before him now, so stark that it felt impossible to be reality. Even now his mind searched for ways that this set of circumstances could make sense. Izuku and Aizawa were close now, closer than they'd ever been, and Aizawa had given up his teaching role for a largely political one. He doubted it was the man's idea, but Yude had been in shambles since the start of the war. It wasn't outrageous to think he could be talked into it. What about Izuku though? It was obvious why Aizawa would have wanted him. He was strong, capable, trustworthy, but so was everyone else in their class. The real question was, why had Izuku accepted? Not just for a year if the director was to be believed, but 3, without any obvious indicators of stopping. His hands tightened on the wheel as he tried to sort through everything he knew. If he took everything at face value, if he assumed it was the truth, then where did that leave things? Where did that leave Deku? He pulled himself out of his thoughts long enough to glance at the map in front of him. Aizawa hadn't been kidding about the house being outside the city. He'd already been driving for 10 minutes and the program estimated that he'd need to continue for about 20 minutes more. Katsuki tried recalling his knowledge of the area, though it only got fuzzier the further out of the city he drove. As the minutes passed by, the less of society he saw, the cluster of cities surrounding Yuta merely lights in the background as the roads grew slimmer and the trees grew larger. He had only been out this far once or twice, the area bare of anything but a few good climbing spots and trails. Even the camps and lake houses strayed away from this part of the woods, the only sign of society an isolated gas station and corner market. As such, the homes this far out were typically older, leftover sheds and estates that were passed from hermit to hermit. His intuition sparked with the same unease he'd had at the school, the difference of what he knew and what was reality, unmatching. He knew Izuku likely wasn't making a huge salary at the school. Yude was a prestigious academy, but given he'd only just started his career there and his small class size, he wouldn't be making enough to be comparable to what a hero agency could offer him. Even with that in mind, though, he'd never been terrible with money, beyond a few impulse purchases with his leftover allowance. He also knew that, small salary or not, all of the students who'd taken part in the Hero War had been retroactively awarded with a fairly sizable nest egg from the government and Hero Oversight Committee. All of which was to say he should have been able to afford a sizable house in the city. So why here? Whatever the answer, Katsuki was no closer to finding it by the time he pulled into the hidden gravel drive. The trees obscured his view of the house up until the last few meters, meaning if nothing else it certainly afforded the young hero his privacy. He wasn't convinced that was a factor though, not after taking a job at one of the most famous hero academies in Japan. Unknowing of what to expect, he rounded the corner, vaguely aware of the phone beeping at his side. A whir of machinery broke the forest quiet as a hidden gate slowly rose from the ground behind him, effectively cutting the road off from unwanted visitors. Katsuki hummed beneath his breath as he glanced to the phone at his side. That must have been why Izuku was so insistent. The only reason he was able to get this far onto the property was because he had the key, riding along with him. Katsuki wasn't sure what to think when the house finally came into view, but the reveal was not as jarring as he had thought. With its isolation, he had feared he was walking into something decrepit or bare. At this point, he wouldn't be surprised if Izuku had holed himself up in some abandoned barn, but the property at least looked livable. The house was split along its bottom and second floors in a strange architectural silhouette, half of the top floor decorated with angled floor-to-ceiling windows. The roofs and bevels cut at strange, artistic angles, a stark contrast to the older, folk houses that speckled the rest of the ghost town. The combination of raw, cut stone and dark wood gave off a vintage air, but the property seemed well kept and maintained. Katsuki's mind wandered to Izuku's old, restored car they had driven to the airport. He'd been giddy when he'd found it, able to see the potential behind the rust and junk. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd made the same face when he'd bought this house, if he'd lost sleep restoring it back to its former glory, into making it a home. Had he picked up his phone to tell him like before, or had he already given up trying by that point? He swallowed hard and forced the thoughts aside. After parking the car and dumping his luggage at the door, he made a quick pass over the property. He may not want to be here, or think it was necessary, but he wasn't going to half but a mission just because neither he or Izuku wanted him around. He kept the phone on him, listening for sensors or the click of security cameras. He would familiarize himself with the program once he was inside, but for now he made a mental note of all the machines he could count, checking for any obvious blind spots or weakness in the hidden gates. As Izuku promised, the system was close to flawless. Not a huge surprise given that it was Izuku, but impressive nonetheless. The back of the house mirrored the front, well-maintained but otherwise unremarkable. Izuku had installed raised garden beds, though all of the plant life looked rather pitiful. The more native plant life had kept itself alive, peppering the yard with bushes and flowers. The biggest thing of note was a sizable koi pond that received fresh water from a small river that ran down his property. It was empty though, strange, given the pond had obviously been through some recent maintenance. Since most of the land was forest, he couldn't be sure how much of it Izuku owned, but an intruder would be hard-pressed to hide anywhere close to the house without being spotted. Satisfied that he wasn't going to be ambushed, he made his way back to the front door. This time the phone wasn't enough. A section of wall next to the door handle lifted once he was nearby. He held the keycard to the revealed scanner, standing still as he heard the whir of a camera focusing. Once it had gotten a good look at him, the phone finally flickered to life and the lock clicked in place, allowing him inside. He dragged his luggage behind him, already eyeing the interior as the door closed itself. It was a good deal larger than he had been expecting. Izuku had clearly gutted most of the original floor plan, the house almost completely open save for a few bedrooms. The walls that had once been used to section it were replaced with exposed supports, the beams simplistic but placed with intention. The first floor housed two separate areas, one side filled with computer and engineering equipment while the other was a more traditional lounge, staged with a few couches and a sizable TV. Dividing the two spaces was a metal staircase, the exposed walls making the second floor seem more like a loft than a completely separate part of the house. The upstairs held most of the living areas, the couches on the first floor near pristine from being untouched. He could see the kitchen as well as a dining area in front of the tall windows he'd seen outside, and if Katsuki had to guess, the two enclosed spaces next to it were bedrooms. Once he was sure that the door had locked behind him, he went back to finishing his patrol. He started upstairs by the windows. The view spanned from the front of the house to the back, giving him a good eye on the property. A few quick tests proved the glass to be custom as well, strong enough to at least be considered bulletproof. With the variety of quirks villains could possess, it was unlikely to ever be completely secure, but it was far more than he'd expected. The kitchen was suspiciously clean, though one look at the minimally stocked cupboards and fridge answered that question quick enough. After all, it wasn't difficult to keep a clean kitchen if you never bothered to use it. The next door opened to a minimally decorated bedroom and bathroom. The freshly stocked travel-size amenities and lack of personal decor gave him the impression that this one was reserved for guests. He dropped off his luggage but didn't bother to unpack. The second upstairs bedroom was locked, and neither the keycard or the phone gave him entry. He made a mental note to ask about it later before continuing his investigation downstairs. The workshop was, unsurprisingly, a disaster zone. Abandoned coffee cups and bowls of instant ramen littered each workstation, his journals and mad scientist scribbles taped with haphazard care to each of their adjoining projects. Ignoring the tidbits of chaos, the machines themselves were rather impressive. There was more variety than Katsuki had suspected, ranging from medical equipment to hero tech. He allowed himself a few minutes to gawk over the complicated gym system, the weight and resistance added artificially to a bodysuit to simulate different training conditions. Next to it were a few 3D printers as well as a computer setup that even Hatsum would have been envious of. He didn't remember Izuku ever being interested in engineering, but it was possible he had picked it up as a hobby. He'd always been thinking of new ways to make their suits better. It was unlikely that had stopped just because they'd graduated. Still, if he could afford this kind of hardware, why was he storing it here in the middle of nowhere? His mind found itself wandering as he checked over the equipment for bugs or spyware, trailing back to the strange interaction he'd had with Aizawa. Before he and Izuku had cut contact, Izuku had yet to debut with any of the agencies, but the director at UA did say he had only taken the job 3 years ago. That left 2 completely unaccounted for, one if he'd kept to his original plan in training with Aizawa. Maybe there had been an incident with a villain? He highly doubted anything could shake Izuku's conviction after all for one, but his disbelief didn't change the reality. He hadn't followed any of Japan's newspapers since he'd moved, but Izuku was a national celebrity, surely they'd have some information on what had happened. He attempted to turn the computer on, but even with Izuku's keys, it remained unusable. With a new focus, he pulled out his own phone and began typing. When it didn't immediately load, he grunted and gave it a pointed throw on the couch. It landed harmlessly, but he felt no better. Instead, he kept his mind busy with overlooking the living area, certain that it would be finished by the time he was done. When he finally picked it up again, he blinked in confusion, an error screen plastered across his browser. He had converted the phone to a local provider the minute he'd hit the ground, but the screen showed he only had access to his phone services. Izuku must have had something that blocked foreign data, though the prick hadn't thought to mention that when he'd sent him out here on his own. With a low growl, he tossed his phone aside again and moved on to the last room. This was the largest of the enclosed rooms, and based on the amount of photos and other furniture, was likely where Izuku actually slept. There were a few shoji doors separating parts of the room, one of which was half open, allowing him to see the small library and writing desk behind it. A part of him was conscious enough to feel uncomfortable snooping around his personal effects, but he knew he'd feel worse if a villain managed to keep something hidden just because Katsuki wasn't thorough. As a compromise, he tried not to actually look at what he was touching, instead narrowing his focus to anything out of the ordinary. And find out of the ordinary he did. Attached to the main bedroom was a crib. No, not just a crib, a whole DMN kid's room, complete with plushies and highchair and baby books. Katsuki blinked as he shook his head, trying to refocus his vision, like he would realize he was hallucinating, or somehow otherwise erase the very clear sight in front of him. He immediately began picking over the bedding and stuffed animals, searching for some sort of answer that didn't equate in what his mind was otherwise screaming. The crib had definitely been used, recently, multiple times, if the collection of forgotten binkies and still fresh crackers were any indication. The setup was too specific to be here for random visitors, the small space littered with pictures of Izuku and his family as well as All Might posters and plushes that Izuku had deemed irreplaceable from his abundant collection. He wouldn't put these out for any random child to play with, these were DMN near sacred. For him to offer them at all, he had to love this child more than he loved All Might, and that terrified him. He acted without thinking, grabbing his phone out of his pocket. He didn't know what he was expecting, what he was trying to do, but the need for Izuku to explain himself, to settle this unease, was so strong that he was already pushing for his contact list before he realized what he'd done. This wasn't his phone. That was shockingly apparent as the home screen lit in his hands to a photo that he didn't recognize, and an Izuku that he no longer knew. His same sappy idiot was staring back at him, with a smile too big for his face, and shimmering, joyful eyes that to this day still managed to haunt his dreams. Only this time, instead of smiling at him, it was his Izuku, holding a little girl that he didn't know, with the same goofy grin and out-of-control green locks, dressed in a faded familiar All Might onesie that he and Izuku had once shared. His body grew numb as he squatted next to the toy bin, his hands cold as they mechanically checked each of the toys for tampering. He wasn't sure where he had put the phone, only that it was no longer in his hands. He was overwhelmed and paralytic, like his mind was still burning out from overuse while his thoughts remained eerily silent. In the simplest terms, he was in shock, acting on basic commands in an effort to keep from shutting down completely. His body halted as he came across a wooden box. The script, "I am here," burned elegantly across the top. Something in him told him to put it away, but the need to finish his task was stronger. When he opened the lid, he found a slew of familiar faces staring back at him. Small, handcrafted cloth and wooden dolls had been dressed and painted to resemble his classmates from 1A, though by their coloring and new designs he guessed them to be copies from their more current suits. He thumbed through the toys on top: All Might, of course, Eraserhead, Uravity. They even had Bird Boy and a separate attachment for his Dark Shadow. The only one missing was them. He tried not to focus on it. These toys were clearly painstakingly made for that little girl. It only made sense that they would give her heroes that were actually around. What use would there be in having a dynamite? He hurried to put the toys away, barely conscious enough to keep from slamming the entire thing to the ground as he returned it where he'd found them. With a calm he wasn't sure he had ever possessed before, he closed the partition and stumbled back to the living room, fractured and thrown. His mind reeled through the sparse interactions they'd had since he'd moved to America, as few and far between as they had been. The topics had never been anything important, and Izuku had always insisted on hearing about his life in the States over discussing his own training in Japan. He'd never avoided the subject, but he had always claimed that his life was more or less the same. Clearly not. Still, Izuku wouldn't have purposefully kept this a secret, not while they were still talking anyway. So, the kid was a new development. He should have figured that out by the crib. A 4-year-old would likely have their own bed by now, and the toys wouldn't be so minimalistic. His eyes glossed across the rooms, noting the lack of baby-proofing and general hazards the house provided. Izuku had also not mentioned dropping the kid off anywhere in his rant about the traffic this morning. It wasn't concrete proof, but it was unlikely that they actually lived here full-time. Izuku also was decidedly missing a wedding band. He remembered thinking the jewelry he was wearing was strange, so he would have definitely noticed that. It was possible they just hadn't bothered with a ring or a marriage, but there wasn't any sign of an extra occupant in any of the other rooms either. What exactly did that leave? That Izuku had a kid, but they were only here sometimes, that he'd fallen in love, had ECC with a woman enough times to get her PRGNI only to end up living here, unmarried and alone? None of that felt possible, but Izuku had surprised him before. He felt like he was going insane, the lack of answers turning him manic. Before he knew what had happened, Izuku's phone was back in his hand, his fingers quick to hide the home screen picture as he opened up the browser. His plan quickly backfired, however, as the phone prompted for a fingerprint. Cursing Izuku's frustrating paranoia, he scrolled through the phone for any kind of loophole. All of the apps refused to load without the fingerprint, and it wasn't as if he knew exactly what he was looking for either. It was highly doubtful Izuku kept some sort of journal or record, at least about himself. His thumb hovered over the contacts, a new idea forming. Just because he'd been in butt and abandoned Izuku didn't mean their other friends had. He scrolled through the most recent calls, trying to ignore the spikes of guilt and embarrassment Ho's behavior was earning. He had no excuses for this, had no reasoning. None of this was for the good of the mission, and he knew if there was something Izuku wanted him to know, he would have said so. The phone was dialing before he'd made a choice, his body acting on its own. The screen centered with Ochako's name and picture, the photo far more recent than he'd last seen her. Her name was the first on the list he'd recognized, though that didn't necessarily mean she'd have the answers he wanted. She and the nerd had always been close though, and if she wasn't the mother to Izuku's kid, it was a good chance she knew who was. He still wasn't sure if what he was doing was right, but he also knew he didn't have the self-control to make himself stop. "Zuku," Ochako's chipper voice answered, not even making it past the first ring. "What's up, baby cheeks? I'm driving so you're on speed dash. Did you and DUF dash? Kerr." The words had tumbled out faster than he could stop them, his lungs gaping with heavy, angry breaths. He could hear the girl's shock on the other line, followed by a tense silence. He gave the phone a quick hit to make sure that she hadn't hung up on him, ready to track her floating but down if she tried running away. Before he could figure out a plan on how to do that, exactly, someone in the car cleared their throat, breaking the quiet. I believe we are in fact not speaking to the aforementioned baby cheeks Ochako, a deep voice corrected. Katsuki recognized it instantly. Even after years apart, Katsuki could place Ida's strange speaking pattern anywhere, even if he did sound less whiny than normal. Yeah, I got that, thanks babe. Why does Deku have all this baby CRP? Katsuki rattled, unable to stop the high now that it had broken through. Katsuki Bakugo, are you at Izuku's residence? He had not alerted anyone else that you would be returning home. Are you switching agencies? If so, have you given any consideration to working with Dash? Shut the F up, Four Eyes. Katsuki screamed, practically shooting himself across the room as he paced. What the absolute hell has been going on since I left? Why isn't Izuku working as a hero? When did he start teaching at U.A? Who the F is that little girl on his phone, and why the hell does she look exactly like Deku? There was a collective gasp in the car, making the hair on Katsuki's neck stand on end. He could hear Ida begin to speak before swiftly being silenced, his low tone cut and muffled as Ochako's hand clamped across his lips. Oh my god, did no one tell you about Ms. Wiro? Ochako asked, and Katsuki could swear he could hear her smiling through the phone, like this was amusing, like the idea of Izuku Midoriya, his Izuku Midoriya having a child and torrid love affair that Katsuki knew nothing about was a goddamn joke. What the F is a Ms. Wiro? He demanded, but of course received no clearer answer. Alright, look, you're calling from Izuku's phone, right? So you're back in town? Obviously Dash, Katsuki growled. Let me make some calls and we can plan on meeting somewhere tonight. Promise you'll come out with us for a few hours and I'll tell you everything. Katsuki shifted on his foot, mulling the proposition over. The last thing he'd wanted was for more people to figure out he was back in the country, and after everything that had gone wrong this morning, he was in no mood to go out and socialize. It had been a shitty day, and was only proving to get worse. He just wanted to sink into bed and forget any of it had happened. Ignoring it wouldn't change anything though, and he knew after what he'd made of himself, Izuku was unlikely to actually answer any of his questions truthfully. Even the stuff Deku doesn't want me to know, he muttered, earning a rather giddy laugh from the woman. Especially the stuff Zuku doesn't want you to know. Actually, it'd probably be best if you didn't bring this up to him at all, just convince him to come meet up before he has a chance to backpedal or make sheet up. Katsue grunted, looking at the clock. Izuku wouldn't be home for a while. That meant he still had time to do some sleuthing before he had to hold up his end of the bargain. If he put enough pieces together, it was possible he'd be able to get Izuku to break without ever having to leave the house. Promises didn't mean sheet when he had all the information he wanted. With this new plan in mind, he nodded, still unable to help but let out a sigh as he quickly jotted down Ochako's number. Yeah, alright, but just for a few hours. Don't f me on this, Ochako. This is serious. This impacts my career. I can't afford to not have the whole picture, he urged, grabbing his own phone from the table. Oh, trust me, we all know how seriously you take your career. Text me your current number and I'll send you the deets once I've figured out the invites. I'll see you two tonight. Katsuki rolled his eyes but grunted in acknowledgement, ending the call. Thankfully he'd already written the number down, as the second he had hung up his own phone began to buzz. He raised a brow, bringing up the unknown number only to find Izuku's phone shutting down. He rushed to find a way to stop it, eyeing the full battery bar before watching his own phone light again. Unknown number, are you making a call on my phone? Your phone should still have service. Please refrain from using my personal devices. Unknown number, Katsuki. I am at work, I can't afford to be monitoring what you're doing on my data. Your phone will work on the server, put mine away and use your own. Unknown number, you called Ochako? You haven't called anyone in 5 years and now you're calling Ochako? Unknown number, Katsuki. Unknown number, Yorton Butt. Katsuki sighed, Izuku's phone now officially bricked. He should have guessed that he had remote access to it. Someone with this level of security wouldn't have it all tied to one device. He was probably granting the house permissions through a secondary program at his desk. He hadn't expected him to figure out he'd been prying so quickly though. The black screen mirrored his own face back at him, but all Katsuki could see was the photo hidden just beneath.